The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. Investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past.
All right, investigated. So, real quick, thanks everybody for joining in. We've got, looks like we're live here on both YouTube, looks like Odyssey and Substack, so that's a good thing. For the Substack, you'll see I have to look down here. I can't put your comments up there, but if you're on YouTube, for some reason your comments go through. Substack doesn't like StreamYard, so apologize for that. We are back here in the Pacific Northwest, back at the headquarters for Secure Point Investigations, where we kind of run most of the Historical Detective Agency stuff out of. But for the last probably month, we were traveling through the United States on something else, but we took the opportunity to be able to kind of do a lot of historical investigation along the way. It's kind of our hobby. And it was nice because the client allowed a lot of time to be able to go do that. And we were able to get a lot of information on things that I was unfamiliar with and some things that I was familiar with, and I wanted to get some more details. So kind of today what we're going to do is we're going to go over some of those things that I found, pretty fascinating going through that I think that were important for lessons learned for today. And they highlight a lot of the paradigm that we operate under, because as you know, the past informs pretty much our perception of today. And so it's kind of an unformed idea of the past that is really clouding a lot of the decisions today. In fact, I've seen it within the military, for example. We'll talk about it today. The real nature of preparedness and the real nature of the road to World War II, especially within the preparedness of the United States military, that myth that has been propagated in order to get some kind of fantasy feeling has hampered readiness and preparedness for wars after World War II. And we saw it again And I think we're seeing it again today. So it's this kind of myth that about, what was the road to Pearl Harbor and then what happened on December 8th. And that kind of thing. And it's the myths that we carry with us on history that continue to be stumbling blocks as we go forward. So that's pretty much going to be the focus today, is getting back into a little bit of some of the historical myths that have propagated themselves within America that need to be a little bit more dispelled in order to have a better paradigm, a better operational model, so that you can understand things going forward. Now, it's going to be, to me, it was very interesting. It was amazingly fun. But before I dive into all of those things, we're going to talk about a couple topics, a few topics. Number one is going to be what I liked, which was the battle between Eisenhower and Patton, which those two duked it out. And it's a battle you've probably never heard of, but it was really formative for the United States Army in World War II in Europe. It was absolutely very, very important, and it shows kind of the emphasis on the military planning and preparation prior to the war, how we managed personnel, how we managed leadership, developed leaders in that run-up to war. That was very, very important, and it's a very good example of what was done right with good outcome, and we kind of forgot it at our peril. In other words, to keep the myth that we were sleeping between World War I and II, we've hampered our ability to be able to train and prepare for future wars and conflicts, and the results just tend to come out that way. That's one thing we're going to talk about, is that battle between Eisenhower and Patton that you may not have heard of, but it's absolutely fascinating and fun, and it's an area where I spent some of my my junior life, and so there's a lot of history in that region. We'll go over that. The second thing we're going to talk about is a little more. We're going to do some more examination about the Spanish and their contribution to the United States independence. Of course, everyone knows that Spain won FIFA, and I actually paid attention for a brief moment because I don't, but it was interesting because I was studying Spain. Spain made it to the finals, and apparently I kept seeing on X, everybody's like, oh, we hate Argentina, we hate Argentina. I'm like, okay, what's this about? So I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, I can see why I hate Argentina. And oh, by the way, Spain's doing really well. And it's kind of nice because on the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence, we kind of forget Spain's contribution to that. And in that forgetting, in that kind of historical amnesia, it leaves out a very critical part about what makes a successful revolution. And we'll talk about the characteristics of what differentiates a revolution from a riot, what makes a successful revolution, and why forgetting what Spain did hampers our ability to kind of conceptualize what future revolutions are, right? In other words, we have this mythical idea about what the American Revolution was, and we miss those key pieces, and you think, okay, we're just going to get, the Minuteman, and we're going to have a great guy, that can't tell a lie and can chop down cherry trees, and he's got wooden teeth, and we're going to win this thing, right? We're all backwoods, we hide behind trees, they march in lines, we wear camouflage, they wear red, and that's why we won. And it's not true. And so we're going to kind of look into a little bit more about Spain's very significant contribution and what are those within the 5 elements that Neil Smelser's talked about for successful revolution. In other words, the difference between a riot and a revolution, right? What makes it a revolution? What makes it a successful revolution? There's 4 to 5 elements, and if you look at the American Revolution, it never made sense to me, right? Why was this? It didn't match Neil Smelser's model, right? But everything else he was good. But was the American Revolution an anomaly? But with this piece of the Spanish contributions put in there, now it makes sense. Now it hits his formulas for those characteristics, those elements that are needed to make it a revolution. And it's insightful. It's very understanding. So congratulations to Spain. And thank you, by the way, for helping America become independent way back when in the 1770s and 80s. So that's the second thing we'll talk about. The third thing, if we have time, we're going to go into a little bit more about some of the details about the history in kind of the Louisiana area and some of the pirate history. And we're just going to touch on it a little bit. But I did want to introduce a little bit of that because that's also very important for the United States independence and history, the commerce of pirates, right? So everybody right now is looking at the Houthis, right? So the Houthis in Yemen that are threatening to block trade and, the pirates and that sort of thing. We have anti-piracy patrols all over the place. I remember when you ship equipment back in the first Gulf War, a lot of units were having to ship it back on sea transports, and you had to assign guards for anti-piracy on a ship right in the 2000s. It just blew me away. These are tanks and Bradleys and that sort of thing, and Stryker vehicles. It's like you need an anti-pirate guard on them, like physical guys. But it's a real element of routes and resources, right? Piracy has been with us a very long time. It is a tool both of national and subnational, and it was very important for building up not just the ability for the United States to kind of raid, interdict, and get a foot in the door with hitting the British where it really hurt them, which was their maritime sea routes. But that skill set that they learned from piracy translated well to the young Continental Navy. I won't go too much into it, but as I was studying a little bit more about the elements that made the American Revolution successful, I saw the pirates, and who doesn't like pirates anyway? So there it is. And I apologize if my voice will change a little bit as I read about the Spanish contribution, because there is a General Galvez who plays a large part in the American Revolutionary War. And for some reason, because I read an article and somebody else imagined him as Antonio Banderas, the voice of Shrek's Puss in Boots is now in my head as him. So for some reason, Antonio Banderas has now become the voice of someone who's been dead for 250 years, but helped out the American Revolution. So before going on, we're going to do one thing here real quick. I did want to show this, and I want to bring up artifacts, what I call artifacts within this. And part of it is, if I could do that, there we go. So this is an artifact found in the Nevada desert, and it has just a little bit of a green tinge to it. If you, before this show is up, in the comments, if you put down what this artifact is, I will send you either a copy of Rape of the Mind, and from Amazon. So, I can set up a gift card so I don't have to know your address or anything like that. I'll do it digitally. But we can set it up with Rape of the Mind. You can do Propaganda or by Edward Bernays, or a copy of Colonel House's book, about the deals of the future. In other words, his Mein Kampf, the American Mein Kampf by Edward House, right? So one of those three books, which are very important for understanding kind of the paradigm that we operate in, I will send those to you. If you are an investigator, however, not just a historically curious, but an actual detailed investigator, I have a great book here that I will share. So if you do guess this at the end, and you're an investigator or a PI, that needs it, this is pretty good, because I've been doing, some wrongful death investigation training and things like that. So friction risk, so identification of fingerprints, so it kind of goes in there. So it's a good baseline for understanding fingerprints. So when you're going through all the police reports and you're going through some of the forensic evidence, you can at least have a good baseline about the science and the technique of lifting fingerprints, examining fingerprints, and that sort of thing. So it's actually pretty good about, that, what materials hold fingerprints and that sort of thing. So let me know what book you want if you can successfully identify this in the comment section prior to the end of this. But again, found in the Nevada desert. It shows up as clear here, but it's got a little bit of an aqua, kind of a green tinge to it. And I'll pivot it up this way, and we'll let you just look at it a little bit more. But each live Detective Lounge, it's kind of what we used to do. We'd always bring up kind of an artifact or a piece of forensics, and then the group kind of has to try to figure it out, because that's part of it is your physical forensics as well, depending where you're at. So it is very heavy. It is made of glass material. And there we go. And it does say made in the USA on the back. It has the numbers 18-84 84 and then :::. And then I'll give you another clue here. Hemingway 45. So there you go. All right. So again, if you can figure this out by the end of it, put it in the comments, and then the first one that actually has it correct, I will send a little thing for that. Generally found them along railroad. Aha, goat. I think goat is on it. Look at that. Oh, very good. Goat got it. That was quick. Good one. Yes, this is an insulator. Now, depending upon the color, you're going to get a little bit different. So these are insulators that were made. They were glass before, we got into plastics and Bakelite and things like that. Glass is a great insulator. As you see, the wires would go off there. They would put these in the poles, usually right along railroad tracks, because those are already cleared and leveled. And it was different colors would actually produce different materials within the glass would produce different colors, and the different colors over time. So you can kind of get the date based upon the color that you're going to get. So for example, if it's like a purple blue, they actually, if you leave them out there in the desert long enough, the manganese in there was what, after sitting there in the sun in Nevada for a long time, especially out there, just direct sunlight, it's going to turn basically kind of a purple blue, and it gets darker the longer it's been out there, right? So it starts off clear, but over the decades, because of the manganese that they used initially in there to kind of harden the glass, you're going to get that discoloration. This one is a little bit of green and aqua. It doesn't show up well in the camera. But this one there's iron impurity. So they would actually make these locally from the sand, right? So they could actually locally use these at some hot houses. They would blow these, and then the sand impurities had a lot of iron in it, because they're just going for the insulation properties. They're not going for beauty or anything like that, and durability. And so that over time would give a little bit of a discoloration to your kind of your green or aqua, which this one is. And then if it stays purely clear, especially out in the sun, then usually you're looking at about 1930s or afterward, and that's where the big manufacturers kind of took over from the local guys, and it was a standard process, and it was more pure glass that went through there. And then, of course, lately we have different polymers and things like that are used as insulators instead of just glass. But there you go. Goat, send me, how do you want it? Do you want me to mail it to you or not? Send me a personal message over on Substack, since you're on Substack, and I will get that to you. So, very good. Blue are the main ones you got. Yep, there's a manganese in that one. So we found clear ones too. Yeah, so the clear ones usually, not always, are after 1930. Sometimes they'll go in the sand and they don't get that ultraviolet, makes it react. But typically, yeah, the clears are after about 1930 because they tended to centralize production from the local production, which had all the impurities. Iron would make it, like this one, a little bit green. But the early ones with manganese, you're going to get that purple or that blue look with exposure to the sunlight with the ultraviolet. So it's pretty cool. So I do like these. I've heard somebody say that they had one uranium glass, but I've not seen that. It's not verified, so I'm not going to say anything about that one other than there was a rumor that there was one. It was probably he was trying to sell me one, but anyway, there's that. So yeah, Goat, go ahead and send me that over there. Marcus West, but Goat, send me a personal message over on Substack. And then I'll get the coupon out to you for Amazon. So basically you can get one of those books, whichever one you want. Or if you have another book, if you already have those, you may be well read already in those fields. You can order whatever book you want on Amazon. So we'll send that to you. Good one. That was actually pretty quick. I might have to make it a little harder next time. So that's pretty good. All right. So, and then there's a question here. Let me go ahead and remove this. Favorite books for investigators. Okay. So Marcus West asked a question. So for investigators, and the thing is, so there's two types here. We're Historical Detective Agency online here with Substack in the group. And so for historical, there's a little different, but for my day job, for investigations, it depends on what kind of work you're going to focus on. So I'm a little bit of everything. So I started out doing a lot of forensics. So I was physical forensics, post-blast forensics before I became a private investigator. We would do post-blast forensics on terrorist bombing sites. So we did, there's the tactical and then the kind of the standard post-blast investigation. Then you go more into like the Domex. You would go into a little bit more of the forensic exploitation, looking at more of the lab work of it. And then typically from that, I kind of migrated over to, looking at the terrorist network. So the funding streams, the training streams, you have a bomb maker, he has a certain signature, right? There's a little bit of a pattern to how he does things, right? Does he wrap the tape this way? Does he wrap the tape that way? How big are his globs of glue that he's trying to make things together? Does he solder? Does he use a glue gun more? You begin to look just like an artist. There's a type of a signature that the bomb makers would have. And then you could sometimes tell if it was him or if it was derivative, or in one case, it wasn't my case. This guy, bomb maker, blew his hand off, so he had to learn to do everything with his left hand, right? So there was a change in his technique, but there was enough there that they're like, it looks like this guy, but it's not. Well, it turns out later he'd blown his right hand off, so he was using his left hand. And so, we're reading that here. Oh, yeah. So, and then from that, then we got into the radicalization process. That was the one that fascinated me. We got the money, we got the funding, we got the training, but I really wanted to know was what was getting inside these guys' head that would make them suddenly make bombs and it's not like a gun. It's not like I'm angry, I'm going to shoot, or a knife and I'm going to, club somebody, stab somebody or club somebody. The bomb is an investment of time, of energy, of effort, of focus. So you have to maintain that level of kind of, commitment, if you will, towards that. And so I wanted to know what was the radicalization process. And so we're looking at that radicalization process in Southeast Asia, mostly with the insurgency in southern Thailand, in Yala, Nandate, and Patani. And the thing that I found was that history was a massive motivator for why a lot of people would radicalize and maintain that radicalization process. And history was also a way to kind of break that radicalization process. In other words, if you present them with, hey, here's the facts. I don't know what you're believing, but here's the facts. Some of them would move on. Some of them would just they're making bombs and they kind of disassociated themselves from it. They weren't the emplacers. They actually some of them didn't even see the results of their work. They just kind of made it as a technical thing, but they were kind of rare. But that was the thing. So that's my background. So it was forensics heavy. When I became a private investigator here in America, so I came back to America, and then somebody said, hey, all the stuff you're doing overseas, you can do here. I'm like, okay, cool. I tended to kind of gravitate to anything. So in the beginning, I was pretty heavy on insurance investigations. So things like, accident investigations, arson investigations, for insurance companies. And there was a clearinghouse that I worked with, Covent Bridge, for a little while, and they would have me as a field investigator going out and looking at, insurance claims and saying, okay, is this, is this fraud? Is this real? What's going on? So, you get a little bit of a different thing in there, and you could look at things like medical fraud. You're looking, anybody that's wanting to do any type of fraud on an insurance claim. So arson, medical, accident, auto accidents, theft, So we looked at a lot of those, and so that's a different style. So a lot of that was looking at elicitations, how to do interviews, looking for medical. So, for example, medical fraud is a whole big. I mean, it was a big manual. I loved it though. It was great. You're dumpster diving in these little seedy medical offices that the doctor would send them over for pain management and treatment, right? So you're hitting the dumpster, counting, literally counting the iodine swabs, looking at Q-tips, looking at the gloves, right? Count the gloves for the number of people that came in there, time the people that come in and out of the office, because what you're doing is you're saying they're just going in there and having a coffee and BSing. They're not actually doing any pain management or treatment. And the clinic, the fraudulent clinic is setting up a front operation, and they're not actually performing the procedures, and they're saving money because they don't even go through the procedures for it. So you would get a case file with the patient or the person, the alleged patient that was going there. You knew what they were claiming to insurance for, and you would surveil them, follow them, and set up a stakeout, and then time them going in there, how many other people were going in there, and then you would do your external investigation. Then you would go inside. And then you would do things like interviews. You would look at, okay, is there dust on some, the acoustic machines, for the ultrasonic machines or the warming infrared muscle machines and all that sort of thing. So you look at the different pieces of equipment, and you had a list that you had to kind of memorize. And you would say, okay, when was the last time that's calibrated? Does that have a sticker on it that it was calibrated? Is there still dust on it? Is it even plugged in? Is it? So you're looking for evidence of fraud to build your case up. So that was one type of investigation. And then from there, you get into general investigation. So there's things I never got into the financial side of it because that requires like a CFE. But I know guys in a couple of associations I'm in, they're very good at it. In fact, James Pete is like really, really good at it, but he's retiring now. So those guys you could kind of lean on and go, hey, can you help me with this investigation? Because there's a financial aspect of it. Go through, and they're like accountants. They can kind of go through and take a look at that. But everything from surveillance, human nature, human behavior is really the core of it. So I would read a lot of things in there. If you're looking at human behavior and things about, if you're interviewing someone and go through, I love I still have books here. I just need to pull those out. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus is the myth of repressed memory, the myth of memory, what memory is, and we teach this in the fundamental investigation course. What memory is not what you think. It's not written in stone. It's not like a VCR or like a recorder, that's recording, and it's there somewhere. I can't remember it. I can't recall it. But if I think long enough, it'll be there, right? So we tend to think of memory like that. It's imprinted and it's stored, and then I just need to retrieve it. It's got clutter, but it's there somewhere in a pristine form. And what Dr. Elizabeth Loftus pioneered, and then others have found and reinforced after that, is that basically your memory is being recreated over and over and over again. And just like if you take a camera up to a TV, you get those impurities in there, and it starts to give that little pattern, right? It begins to diffuse the memory. It begins to corrupt the memory. So your memory is just re-remembered. Like you draw a picture, and then you tear it up, and you draw a picture, and you draw a picture. You tear it up, and you draw a picture, right? So I'm drawing a picture, and I tear that off. I draw a picture. I tear that off. I draw the same picture. I tear it off. Little imperfections are going to be introduced in that picture over time. The same with your memory. Imperfections are going to be introduced over time, and it's dependent upon your age. It's dependent upon your cognitive ability. Like, were you trained to remember things? Do you understand what you saw? So, for example, a 6-year-old observing a surgical event, right? They walk into an operating room at 6 years old. They accidentally go in there, and they see the operating table. They don't know what they're looking at, right? They think it's humans getting butchered, right? That's their memory. I saw this guy in a white coat with two ladies around him, also in white coat and masks, and they were slicing open that human being. That's what a 6-year-old is going to see, right? And it's going to be reinforced over time. And then as he grows up, that memory, because they see it and they remember it as a butchering, even if he learns about surgery later, he may not make that association that it was surgery. He's still going to see it as somebody's getting butchered on a table, and it will alter to be able to fit more into the butchering rather than surgery as he learns over time. Human memory is remarkably malleable. It's manipulatable. And like I said, Dr. Elizabeth Loftus just does tremendous work with that. She's been on the Department of Justice for expert witness list, FBI expert witness list. I mean, pretty much in everybody's Rolodex, they're calling her up for expert testimony on memory. Because it absolutely, that's why we have in capital cases, right? You have to have corroborating testimony. You can't have testimony of one person in a case, a capital case, because their memory's gone, right? Their memory is malleable. If you read a book, for example, war veterans, and I've literally watched this war veteran in a battle. the adrenaline's going, he's got, you've got suddenly tunnel vision sometimes, there's a lot happening. You can't process everything. You can't see everything, right? You can only process a certain bandwidth with your eyes, your ears, your brain. Your brain will fill everything in. It's gestalt, right? Your brain begins to fill in what it can't see in order to kind of comprehend and move forward. It's just a survival ability that we've had for generations. But over time, if that battle is made into a movie or into a book, that veteran, even though he was there, will begin those memories potentially can corrupt his memory, and he will not remember what he saw. He will remember what that movie showed, right? And then even if there's a video of him, right? Like in Vietnam, that thing was filmed, and there was some film that just disappeared. I forgot what the photographer's name was, but there were Vietnam veterans that literally remembered it a different way until they saw the film that had been gone for like 20 years at that time. It was like late 80s, and then the film was shown to them again of the firefight they were in. It was a LZ, and the helicopters were coming in, and then there was an ambush as they moved over. The improvised claymore had gone off and hit the first group, and they remembered it a different way. They actually remembered like an armored vehicle that the NVA had. It was interesting, and they self-replicated that memory until the video or the film that was then brought back out. They saw it and they're like, oh, it was different than they imagined. Some things were the same, but because there had been like a TV show, I forgot what the TV show was, based on that, they implement that put into their memory. And the TV show had a little armored car that the NVA had, right? And so that imprinted in their memory as if it was theirs. Never existed except in that TV show, that recreation of it. And that happens over and over and over again. And, not just the veterans, but everybody. So Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, if you want to learn about memory, that works both in investigations and in historical investigations as well. So, for example, if I'm interviewing a witness for the insurance fraud or something like that, or criminal defense investigations, you would look at that, and they may not be lying, but they're not telling the truth, right? In other words, they believe what they're saying. They're trying to remember it, and what they see in their mind, they may be truthful about it. So you get this vibe, well, they're telling the truth. Yeah, but it's not the truth. It's the truth as they remember it. But that memory has been recreated over time, and it doesn't represent the event that actually happened. So hopefully that explains it. Boy, that was a long explanation. So Dr. Elizabeth Loftus for one. Another couple of good investigation books that I like for a hobby. Well, let me show you the hobby. When we do some of these with the Think Like a Detective on the adult section, not for the kid section. Kid section has a different one. But these are kind of neat. I go over old murder cases, and these are murder cases from 1865 to 1939 is this set. And it's pretty interesting because it goes over the maps, because for criminal defense investigation, there's a series of things that you do. So this will have maps. They'll have the crime scene, some of the crime scene photos in there, the witness testimonies. In other words, the evidence, get over there, the evidence that the police were seeing at the time, right? And then you get all that, and then some of these are unsolved. Some of these are solved, but you can say, okay, was that true or not? And then you go back over the maps, right? And I like to plug these back into the actual kind of scale maps to look through, and then what's around it, right? what was alleged around there. So basically, you're recreating some of those case files, and it's kind of a fun game for procedures and go through and for our Think Like a Detective. You're going through, okay, this is a witness statement. How do you take out the who, what, when, where, lay it out in a timeline? Okay, does that timeline match up between these 2, 3, 4 witnesses? And then the final police report, does that match, right? Okay, where are the discrepancies? All right, now let's go to the physical, right? So we have the evidence that was in the crime scene locker that they, print out in the book. Okay, let's go back. And they say they found that on the wall. Well, the photograph shows that wall's not even there, and the wall is pointy and sharp. How can you put an object on it, right? You need a flat surface to put an object on it. What was it, balancing? Was the knife like balanced on the wall? So you can look at these things and look at discrepancies in a case and go through it. So that's kind of a neat book. I like that one. Then there's a number of them that come out for like OSINT. I've got a number of them on OSINT. That's the big one right now, is open source intelligence and kind of doing those procedures. The problem with the OSINT books is if like I got one last year or 2 years ago, it's already out of date because AI. So a lot of us, I'm on like a couple of chat groups that come through, and they'll send a lot of information out. There's a couple of X channels that I follow. They're really, really good about looking at all the AI agents now, and okay, this is the protocol for doing really good OSINT. Some of the tasks that you can automate for doing your OSINT, but always look at it because a lot of it there's a lot of holes still within even an AI-driven OSINT that I found a lot of problems. So actually, you know what? I'm going to do that. So I'm going to bring those books out. So the next time we're going to do like a trade craft of modern private investigation. I'll bring out all the books, so it's kind of neat about what I like to read for that. And there's some big forensics manuals that are pretty good, and then some manuals there. But like I said, a lot of stuff is kind of old, but I like the older stuff. And to give you one example, one of the first techniques that I learned on surveillance is the human face, right? How do human beings react? Again, human behavior is everything. And forensics is, the second. Human nature, understand human nature first, and then you can kind of get forensics, right? Because you want to know the motive, right? What the heck's the motive? You can get the means, you can get the opportunity, but what's the motive, right? That's the key for a lot of things. Get that motive. That's all human nature. But one of the things that was taught early on for surveillance is the human beings, like dogs, react within a 20-degree span, right? So if my face is within 20 degrees of my person of interest, I don't want to say target, person of interest, within that, they can still alert to it, right? But once I go past the 20 degrees, right, now they're not, and the more that my face is away and less of my face is visible to them, the less that they're going to be seen, the less that they're going to see me as a threat or of interest. The same as a dog. You sit there and stare at a dog, look straight on at them, they get nervous, right? They're alerted to it. So anytime that you can move your face during a surveillance, and I can get a camera over there and I've got the feed to my phone, I'm over here talking to somebody, or I'm pretending to talk to somebody, or I'm on my phone, but I'm checking it because I've got the feed to the remote camera that I've got. Then it works, right? But some investigators, especially the young ones, they see the TV and they're over here doing this, and they're within that 20-degree span, and they get burned sometimes, right? Because they're not. You got to really move your face past that 20 degrees, and more the better. But that's just human nature, right? If I'm facing someone, they're going to be more alert to me, and they're more apt to recognize me than if it's a profile view or more. So that was that 20-degree rule, right? Try never to get your face within 20 degrees dead on to your target if they're within 20 degrees, or they can look at you or glance at you. So that was one of the old rules, and that was a very old book. In fact, it was the Gumshoe Detectives from 1956. And it was great because it was all about old surveillance techniques. Some of the stuff's gone, right? You keep files on people and things like that, how they got information, how he's able to look in phone books and make calls and things like that. And he could do things at hotels you can't do anymore. But the human nature aspect of it, right? For human behavior and throwing people off because they don't think they're being followed is pretty good. So far, I like his stuff. So I will actually do that for Jif versus Jiffy Peanut Butter. What? Okay. So for Marcus West, the next time we do it, I'll bring out all the stuff and we'll just do a trade craft on modern investigations. And I'll probably show you some of the AI stuff. It's still iffy, a lot of it, but a lot of it's still, it's useful for being able to look up some things. But there's a lot in there that'll get you in trouble if you don't know what you're looking at. And if you get the wrong information and you make an application for something, you could get in trouble. So anyway, all right. So do you have a link to your course? Yes, Marcus. There's two of them. There's Think Like a Detective. We were gonna set it up through a different system. What we're gonna do is anybody that's subscribed to the Substack. So if you're paid on Substack, you're just gonna get the course for free, and it's one for you and one for your kid. The difference between the kid is we're not going to give them the murder stuff, right? So the adults get the murder stuff, crime scene and all that, because there's like I said, there's photos in here. And I've got a collection of some cases. The kids, though, they get. In fact, it was fun. I was just doing this today. So we kind of do similar to the Myrtle. So in other words, the deductive reasoning. So we teach kids deductive reasoning, right? Okay, look at the logical, follow the logic, don't follow your emotion, right? It's evidence-based, not emotion-based. So we do a lot of those, and then we work on some of these. We teach the kids thinking toolkit. We use a lot of these processes, and then this one, and then for the course, in fact, I was just doing it. Hang on a second. For the kids, they get to examine this one, and this was actually pretty interesting. So back in the 1890s, there was a what now we'd consider UFO, but it was airships. There was this airship flap in California. And there's all these newspapers back then. It went all the way from California, like Colorado, and then ended up like crashing in Texas. But nobody knows who it was, right? And it was kind of an advanced airship at the time, but enough people saw it in enough areas, so it looked more than a hoax. Like it wasn't just around San Francisco where it kind of originated. It was all over the place. So the kids go through here, and they're actually going to make a timeline. They're going to look at things like, okay, what was airship technology? What was speed rate? What was weather? Historical weather. You can get some of that. What are the general trade winds? And they can actually kind of go through this case and look at that. And then we add some things in there because it's kind of a sparse case, but it's a historical case file they can look at. and then they can kind of get that in there. So it's pretty good for being able to lay out timelines and say, okay, does this pass the smell test? Is this one craft, two craft, that kind of thing? And then they have to do research about airships, and they find it's not just Zeppelins and Goodyear blimps. Before that, who had what airship when. So is this technically feasible or not? Is it within the realm of the probable? Okay, is it possible? Is it probable? So we teach kids that. So it's a little more fun, a little better than murder. But the adults, they can do either one, or if they have a specialty one, because we had one group that just wanted to do World War I, the road to World War I. So we did that one. Okay, so I will give you a link to the course. I need to finish it. That's what I'm doing now when I got back from the trip. So we'll get into that, and I will show you the link. And like I said, if you're a member on Substack, you've got it. So we'll send you the link on that one. And then you get some cool stuff for the kids too. My daughter sets up little stickers and stuff for all the detectives. And then the kids part, she teaches a lot of that about all the different detectives. So for example, there's actually a private investigator in Florida she's a pet detective. I'm not kidding. It's not just a movie. She's a pet detective out of Florida, but she has two canines and she's trained them. One of them tracks dogs, one of them tracks cats. And so she'll actually get there. So she tries to get there pretty quick, and then they'll actually track it to the last known spot of the dog. And then from that, she sets up this little ring of posters. And then she's got a neat way of doing Facebook so that it targets that area. And then with the pictures of the dog and everything, and then going out from there. Because usually the dog is, most of the time they'll be picked up or something, or a cat climbs up a tree, and then sometimes it's another animal. But she's literally focused on dogs and cats, and she's got actually a pretty good success record. She was actually highlighted in one of those PI magazines I've got. That's how I found out about her. But yeah, she's down in Florida. So that's one of the types of detectives that's highlighted in the Think Like a Detective course for kids. They're introduced to different types of detectives. So yeah, there's a pet detective. There's a forensic analysis, which is just a lab. You're working through that. There is the accident investigator, that looks through that. And then there's a traditional PI. So they kind of go through different types of investigators for kids so that they realize that, using this skill set, there's actually a broad range of jobs and career fields you can eventually go into and things like that. And like I said, for the adults, we kind of make it that. And then if you're in Washington State, you can actually, I teach the private investigator qualification course for Washington State. So if you want to be a licensed private investigator here, I can train you on that. And I do the requirement for Washington State is mostly just the regulations to keep you out of jail, keep you from getting shot, keep you out of jail, and then make you successful. But I add to the Washington State requirements, and I'll give you a basic surveillance course as part of that. And we'll do the covert surveillance that you work through, mobile surveillance, static surveillance. And then there's an advanced surveillance course, which goes into rural, which is actually harder than urban. Urban ops, pretty easy. Rural, especially like there's 3 houses on this farm road in the middle of nowhere. That's a hard surveillance, right? So in other words, I got to be out there for 12 hours and I have to camouflage myself, and I can't be on private property, right? So ask me about that one. And later, and if you take the course, I'll tell you about my 92-year-old client that had me check on her 87-year-old boyfriend. I thought, how hard could this be? And it actually was, but it was a good example of, everything that could go wrong in a rural investigation for surveillance. So that was kind of fun. All right. So I will send that out to you, Marcus. Thank you for that. All right. So we're going to get into this now. So if you successfully identified that, don't forget, go send me over your information on private message so I can get those books out to you. Now, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is actually I'm going to go into a little bit about the Spanish, because this blew me away, and it continues to blow me away. Going back to the 250th anniversary that we just had, and I did a little bit of it on just a quick draw live stream, I think back on July 4th, when I was in Pensacola and I was looking at all this stuff. This Neil Smeltzer, if you ever get a chance, it's a very old book, 1950s, but it's very good. Neil Smeltzer has a book called The Theory of Collective Behavior. In it, he describes the difference between a riot and a revolution, and he describes different types of rioting, right? All rioting is not the same. There's raids, right, which goes on. There's riots. There is what he calls demonstrations, where people, like young kids, want to come up and punch a policeman, right? And he says this goes way back to thumping a bull, right? You go into a field and guys would run up and hit a bull, and that proves their machismo, right? Those dynamics haven't changed. It's just the stories that were put around these types of riots, protests, demonstrations, those are different, right? So all protests are not the same. Some are raids. They want stuff, right? So they're protesting to go through. Most of the Los Angeles riots, if you remember from way back in the day, that was mostly a raid, right? It was masked as a demonstration, masked as a riot. But what makes a revolution? And what Neil Smeltzer found was that, contrary to most popular kind of myths, there are certain elements which must be present in order for a revolution to A, be a revolution, not a riot, and B, to be successful, right? To have a chance of success. And he says all revolutions through that. Every revolution that I've looked at matched those requirements. And two of the most interesting are, number one, you had to have elite, what he calls elite, but I call it oligarch, but it's elite backing from within. So within the governing system, within the power structure, a certain element which controls a certain portion of the existing power structure of that government must be sympathetic or neutral, but preferably sympathetic. It could be neutral in the beginning, but then go to sympathetic toward the revolutionary cause. Without that, it's not successful. The second part, which was interesting, is there must be foreign support, right? So those two elements are key, and they're usually left out of a lot of the discussions. So, for example, if we look at the Bolshevik Revolution, right, there are many anti-czarists even within the czarist court, right? So even within the leads, you can see that in the Red Army generals, you had a lot of the czarist officers transitioned over and became Red Army officers. Well, how is that possible, right? So in other words, they were opportunists and they didn't like the czar, right? They're just there for, whatever it is. The second part was foreign support. People don't realize that the United States, with Wilson and House, Colonel House, Edward House, moved Trotsky, who was living in New York, in $1 million penthouse apartment with an icebox, which in those days was phenomenal, a phone, and a chauffeur driver. They gave him a special diplomatic visa in his passport, and they moved him through Nova Scotia, right? Worked with the Canadians to go ahead and get him out because they had detained him and so those Russian revolutionaries on the ship, moved him with a significant amount of gold to Moscow, right? So they moved him over into Russia. They moved him out of New York there, and this was a deliberate push by Wilson and Roosevelt. In addition to that, a guy named Gordon Thompson provided about $1 million of financing for the Bolsheviks. And there was a number of revolutionary groups that were there, but the Bolsheviks got the majority of the help from the United States. It wasn't officially United States, except for Wilson promoting Trotsky to get over there. But the financial part was definitely within the United States. It was based in the United States, and it was allowing both the transactions to occur from the Bolsheviks out. There was a certain amount of diplomatic recognition. And Thompson was lobbying a number of nations to go ahead and accept international transactions with the Bolsheviks so they could buy things, buy arms, buy food, buy all that kind of stuff. And so there was a tremendous amount of external support from actually a bunch of people on Wall Street to be able to support the Bolshevik Revolution from the outside. Right, so that was foreign government support for the Bolshevik Revolution. The same in the French Revolution, the same in the Iranian Revolution. You have those elements, right? So there's the internal oligarchs, the internal elite, a section of the existing power structure that goes, but also you have a tremendous amount of foreign support. Now, in the American Revolution, I couldn't really find it. When I was growing up in the 80s, 70s and 80s, they always said, the foreign support was okay. There was Lafayette. He had a fleet that kind of, kept the British a little bit at bay, but not much. So the British fleet couldn't really resupply because they were afraid of the French, or they were cautious of the French, not necessarily afraid, but they were cautious. And then there was von Steuben, who was the drill master, right? The German drill master that kind of, got those, those Minutemen into shape and they got drill. But in the same breath, it would say the reason we beat the British was because the Minutemen could fire behind cover and they had to march in single file with redcoats. So which story do you believe? But that was the dominant narrative kind of going up. And so as I'm studying revolutions and kind of looking at all the other revolutions, testing Neil Smelser's theory of collective behavior in riots and revolutions, how does this work? And what I found was an anomaly within the United States. And so I just kind of passed over it. I didn't dig too much into it. But the missing piece came up when I was down in Pensacola, and I was studying Bernardo de Galvez, who was the governor of Louisiana. And Louisiana was more Spanish for longer than it was French, which surprised me because my dad was in Fort Polk twice. So I was in Leesville, twice growing up. And I was like, I thought we were all French. But no, it was actually more Spanish for longer. And really surprising in that. And some of the things that really come out, number one was the support, the financial support. So always remember wars, revolutions, routes, and resources. Where is it? And to look at that war, to understand the American Revolution and why it was successful, you have to first kind of understand the First World War. And I don't mean the one 1914 to 1918 or 1919, depending which way you look at it. That's not the First World War. That's the one we label as it. But the 7 Years' War was actually the first world war, global war, right? Because you had France, you had Britain, you had Spain, you had Prussia, you had Austria and Portugal, and you had battles all the way from Batavia. You had them in India, you had them in what's now China, you had them, in the United States, in the colonies. We called it the French-Indian War, but it's really the 7 Years' War, right? And so this was a global war in America, in Asia, in India, all over in the Mediterranean and in Europe, right? The whole world is fighting, and these are the same people fighting all over. Mostly France and Britain; those are the two main ones, but others were in there. That's how the rise of Prussia, when Prussia kind of became a major player in the game, and then Austria had to kind of take a step back, and the Holy Roman Empire began to kind of fade. But it really set the stage for the maneuvers that how America now, the North American continent, was now shaped. Right? The French were gone, right? So the French were moved out. That leaves an opening for the British. The British now become secure in their sea power, and now they can begin to move forward. But they are debt, massive debt. Halfway through the 7 Years' War, when they had a new king, he was like, I want to get out of here. And the Prime Minister Pitt's like, no, you're going to stay in this war. So Britain had their problems, a lot of problems with that, and they needed financing. So who do they go to finance the recovery effort after the 7 Years' War? That's right, the colonies, right? The American colonies. So they start kind of leaning on us with taxes, and that creates a lot of problems. And as far as representation, I did find 3 Americans that were in the British Parliament. They actually served in British Parliament, but they were colonials. So that was kind of interesting. But for representation, that wasn't there. Now, looking at that, so Britain is offset because of the 7 Years' War. France is out of the picture. Spain is the dominant power within the continental United States. Why? When you look at, let me get some maps out here. When you look at the maps of the Spanish possessions within the continental North America, right? They were there some places from 1560 onward, right? And they had a tremendous amount, not just of presidios or the monasteries that were out there, right? So they wasn't just that. They had settlements. There were Spanish settlers that came over, and they were working areas, especially like New Mexico, all up in there. And then they had tremendous amount of money, revenue, huge revenue was coming out of silver mines, 2 of them. One of them was in South America. The other was in Mexico. And they were moving that silver in 2 different directions. The first route, the silver was going from Mexico City, or the mines in Mexico, that was going over to mostly Spain and Europe, right? So it was going the Atlantic. But the ones that were in South America, also some in Mexico, they were using along the trade route to go to China. Now, if you looked at an earlier article we did on the silver samurai, Japan was the world's leading producer of silver during the Sengoku Jidai period. So talking the early or late 1400s, early 1500s, Japan was a tremendous amount of silver, and it was very important to Portuguese and Dutch because they needed that silver to buy goods from China. It wasn't quite China at the time, but it was the empire that we now think of as China. But they were only going to take hard metals, right? That was it. And so for a while it was Japan, but Japan's mines suddenly ran out at the same time the Spanish found gold in the Americas, silver in the Americas. And there was gold there too, but mostly silver. So they were able to do that trade. And so that kind of took over as Japan moved down. And then about the 1500s, late 1500s, early 1600s, when Tokugawa came in, Japan kind of closed itself because they recognized that, the Dutch were going to keep coming in. The Portuguese were looking hard and heavy, and the British were starting to sniff. So they said, okay, we're seeing what's happening elsewhere. We're not going to be part of that. So they closed down to the trade system. But there was a tremendous amount of Asian trade in the 1400s and 1500s by Spain and by the Dutch and by the Portuguese. And so that Spanish silver was moving in Pacific and Atlantic. So they had a tremendous amount of wealth based on their ability to be able to mine it in the Americas. And they had colonies. They had set up a lot of areas within America that lasted from the 1500s on up until basically the 1800s, right? When they handed it over to America, right? So, I mean, this was, we're celebrating 250 years just now of the Declaration of Independence. So back in the 1800s, Spain in some places was celebrating 250 years, right? So they have they have a tremendous amount of longevity within the continent. And they had areas, presidios all up into, in fact, even in Oregon. There is some evidence I'm looking at right now that Lewis and Clark, remember we studied Lewis and Clark when they found that Northwest Passage. I always imagine them, alone, with their Indian guide and their canoes, going across there in their ships and their camps. But there is evidence, I have to chase it down, but it was from University of West Florida, which looks so far they've just been phenomenal. That actually they were going from Mission to Presidio to Mission to Presidio. They were following Spanish routes. They were just looking for a route this way, whereas Spain was just interested in creating those roads that were moving the silver up and out, right, and toward that. In fact, Charlotte, what's now Charlotte, South Carolina, was founded by the Spanish. It used to be Florida, the La Florida, and that was basically to get the Spain needed another road for silver inland, because if they were going through the Caribbean, Britain began to move into the Caribbean, and they were a massive sea power, and they were giving letters of marque pirates to be able to raid those Spanish ships. Plus, hurricanes wrecked more Spanish ships than the pirates did, and there's a lot of hurricanes down there, and they couldn't predict them. So they wanted it inlands where they could kind of go up into the coastal areas, and South Carolina was theirs. So initially, and then they could go in there, and that was Charlotte, Paris Island, and they were going to move that over to Spain. So that was going to be the launching point to kind of get them out of that kind of danger area down in the Caribbean. So that's the picture that we look at initially. Now, during the 7 Years' War, which is the First World War, technically, the 7 Years' War, the Spanish, because they had lost Gibraltar, they had lost these areas, they had to give up territory. So they gave up Western Florida, right? So you're looking at Mobile, which is now kind of, there's Alabama, there's a little bit of Louisiana in there, and then a little bit of Mississippi, and then Florida. That's kind of Western Florida, the Panhandle Plus. And then now that became the British. And the British were going to use that because now they've got contact point with the Mississippi. And now they were looking at being able to kind of stitch together the northern areas in Canada along the Mississippi and begin that. And then they were going to push the Spanish out. That was their goal. And then eventually their plans were, okay, we're going to conquer all. It's going to be a Spanish-free Caribbean. There's not going to be any Spanish down here at all. And then they're going to move in and try to go for that sweet, sweet silver mine there in Mexico, right? So they eventually were going to get there, right? They were looking at kind of how to do that. They also wanted to protect their sugar, which was like their white cocaine, right? There was like basically the cocaine of the day was sugar. And it was the British were growing it like crazy in the Caribbean, and it was going up and providing a tremendous amount of money to the British Crown and to Britain at the time. And then that was threatened by the Spanish. Now, once they had that Western Florida, then that's a cap on the Mediterranean. So they were a little safer there, right? So it allows them to be able to manage a little bit more. They fortified Pensacola. They were in Mobile Bay. They were up in Natchez. So they moved in these areas, what's now Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. That was the British grabbing that. But they only had it for a couple decades. Because what happens is now the colonies start to rebel. Now, before the colonies rebel, this is important. Remember Neil Smeltzer. I always wondered what underwrote the American dollar. Right, the Continental Congress, when they were able to issue script and underwrite it, how did they do that? Well, it turns out that as early as 1775, the Spanish were giving loans, or actually they just gave money, to the American colonies. So the Continental Congress, before the Declaration of Independence, was receiving that sweet, sweet Spanish silver and gold to be able to underwrite their continental money. So I found that was absolutely critical, because how do you fund a revolution, right? You've got to have it. And so that was a deciding factor in even some of the founding fathers going, okay, we can underwrite this now, right? Because without money, how's this going to be a revolution? And everybody forgets that part, right? How are you going to fund this thing? And so Spain was a big part of that. Spain was a huge, and they gave not just one loan. So they gave that 1775, they gave money. And then there were 3 representatives that came over. And it was the first loan was about almost the equivalent of like $1 billion. It was substantial. And then there was 3 American representatives that went over to Madrid. And then they were able to get, I think it was another $21 million in silver. So they were able to get that. So that became what we were able to issue our paper money for, because we weren't going to be able to use that. We weren't going to be able to do the British, underwrite it with the British. And what do we have? Beaver pelts. So that become a big deal. And so that was very interesting to me, is that, okay, that's a key piece in this thing, was the funding. So that's the first part. And I said the British with the sugar was crazy. Okay, so that's the first part. And then in 1776, there's written traffic between Benjamin Franklin and the King of Spain. Benjamin Franklin asked the King of Spain, can you please join in, on our side in the revolution? And the King of Spain, we don't have the response, but the King of Spain did tell Galvez that when he sent Galvez to become the governor of Louisiana, Spanish Louisiana, in New Orleans, he said, okay, we're going to go to war on the side of the Americans against Britain. And it was basically to get back their territory that they had lost in the 7 Years' War about 40 years earlier, right? So they're wanting to balance the books back and get northern Florida. That's what they're looking at. They also want Gibraltar because Britain had taken Gibraltar from them during the 7 Years' War. So they want that Mediterranean, right? Gibraltar's right in their southern area. So they have an axe to grind with Britain, and America is going to help them get there. So what happens is that basically Galvez moves over to Louisiana, but they have to buy their time. So Louisiana territory becomes kind of like Casablanca. There's a bunch of South Carolinians. I talked about this in July 4th, a bunch of South Carolinians that come over. That's the first U.S. Marines. They build themselves as first U.S. Marines, and they begin raiding up and down the Mississippi. Some of them, I think, were on the Sabine River even. They have some evidence of that. And they were raiding the loyalist Americans along that. The settlers that were loyalist Americans, they're hitting them, and then they escape back into the safe area, which is the neutral zone, which is Spanish-controlled Spanish America, and then it's an insurgency, basically, right? And everybody knows an insurgency, what happens afterward. Refugees, right? Families are like, I got to get out of here. And Galvez opens up the Spanish territory and goes, hey, you'll be safe here, right? The U.S. Marines are not going to hit you if you're in Spanish territory. So they cross the Mississippi into Spanish territory, depopulating a lot of that areas. That's revenue down, that's farming down, that's a support for the military, because the military outposts that the British have rely on local farmers sometimes, right? So that depopulation of those areas now works in the favor of the rebellious colonists and not the loyalists and not the British. And so that's Galvez. But he does that for a while. He does have to put a leash on the Marines because they get a little nuts. And so they get really a little too aggressive. So Galvez says, hey, slow your roll there, buddies. Let's keep this, civil as much as you can. But he does allow them to keep a lot of their ships, and they sell it in court. He also provides a lot of gunpowder. That was like 9 million pounds or 900,000 pounds of gunpowder to the American Revolution. He also sends up a bunch of spies and agents up there to assist the colonials, and they're in courts in Europe, so they're getting information back and forth to the colony. So as much as we kind of look at the early clandestine services of the colonials, we always look at that as either the British that have come over to the American revolutionary side, or the loyal or the revolutionary American colonists that are able to infiltrate and work within the British social system within the continent. What we forget is there were Spanish or people loyal to Spain that were also providing information and intelligence because they had been operating within that British system for quite some time. and they were assisting the colonists. So that's another part that we forget, is that intelligence gathering, that information and communication was augmented by Spain. So some of our intelligence gathering was there. The British were also, when John Paul Jones, the pirate, was running around hitting ships, Spain was a free port for him. They would supply John Paul Jones with that. Beef and cattle at Caballeros would move up from Texas, and they would go through what's now Fort Jessup in Louisiana, and they would move up, and they were providing beef up in that area. So Britain wanted to kind of do what eventually the Civil War grant did. They were going to come down the Mississippi, the north and the south, from Canada. They were going to go to the Mississippi, and then they were going to invade from Pensacola and Mobile over into New Orleans, capture it, and then move up and pretty much slice it and then come in and wipe out the colonists. But what happened was that Galvez, through his spies, figured that out. That's what their plan was. He sent a lieutenant up. They waxed him right there at the Canadian border up near, I think it was Michigan. So they hit him up there, what's now Michigan. So they can't come down the river. And then he launches before they can attack him. He launches an offensive operation and captures Mobile Bay with the help of the U.S. Marines under a new commander who was a little more stable. And then they go up into Natchez. They capture that fort. And now they do the siege of Pensacola. And in only a few weeks, they managed to destroy the fort of Pensacola. Now, this is about 1781 is during this operation. And they begin to hit at the same time. They're assaulting Gibraltar. There's a siege of Gibraltar. At the same time, they took over another island in the Mediterranean that the British had. The name escapes me right now. And they and the French were now linking up, and they were making a combined fleet, and they were threatening to invade the home islands in Britain. So all of this is going on at the same time. They're giving letters of marque and saying, we're going to raid all those sugar ships, those sweet white crack ships that are coming from the Caribbean up to the British Isles, which the Crown gets about between 9 to 12% cut every time it transacts. And it has funded the equivalent of like our tech bazillionaires now. They can sit in the White House. They're there during the inauguration of a president. Well, there was that equivalent back then. These were bazillionaires based on that sugar money, and they were called the plantation-crats in Parliament. So the plantation-crats in Parliament had a tremendous voice. And once Florida was gone, so that Western Florida, that foothold they had is gone, the the Spanish begin to move down, they begin to combine with the French, and they're going to start hitting the Caribbean. And they're going to threaten Barbados. They're going to threaten all of those areas in the Caribbean. That's going to knock out the sugar trade for the British, and that's going to hit them in the pocketbook really hard. And in addition, their home island might get hit. In addition, they may lose Gibraltar eventually. Now, they never did, but that was a threat. And so all of this calculation was coming into Britain at that same time. It wasn't just Yorktown. It wasn't just what the Americans were doing. That's a part of it, but that was a part of a much larger war. That was the foreign support for the revolution that Neil Smeltzer talks about. Again, theory of collective behavior, but was always kind of missing in our traditional history books. But with this, now those two elements come into it. The foreign support, the internal elites, the plantation-crats going, hey, not my sugar money, right? Call the ball here. Let's do a peace deal, but because I don't want Spain taking the Caribbean, right? That's our money. And the Crown knew it too, because they get, again, 9 to 12% cut on all the shipments. And it was a closed system. You couldn't buy sugar from anywhere else. You weren't buying French without huge tariffs that were coming in there. So that was the key that really hit into the American Revolution and why it was successful, and that was Spain. So Spain, when they won the FIFA World Cup, it was nice because it was like, hey, I remember they helped the Americans out, and it was interesting. Now the army that Galvez had, I'm just the one last thing I forgot on that. It was absolutely fascinating. I started looking up and cataloging his army, right, and what Spain was able to mobilize when he invaded Mobile and Natchez and then Pensacola and took them away from the British was absolutely amazing. So he had troops, a militia initially from the Canary Islands, the German coast. The French had brought in, when the French owned New Orleans, they brought in Germans because they said they were hardy farmers, and there was a whole big German area down there I didn't know about. Acadians, a bunch of native tribes, and then free men of color. Now remember, I'm going to talk about this, which is interesting, that there was laws that the Spanish did in the Americans in about the mid 1500s, late 1500s, that were interesting. So they, if you were of color, freed slave, for example, from the British system, you had rights. That was very interesting. You didn't have as many as some of them, but you had a lot more than you would have in the British area, which was fascinating to me. Then, in order to mobilize the army, in addition, you had the South Carolina Marines. And then you had troops from Spain, Majorca, Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Mexico, Ireland, France, and of the Americans. And it was very interesting. So in the siege of Pensacola, you had groups of, you had the Creole, some of the different tribes in there. There were tribes that were loyal to Spain that were attacking Pensacola, fighting mostly the Creek. The Creek Indians were very much aligned with Britain. In addition, you had a lot of the Americans, refugees from Maryland and Maine. So when the colonies started, when George Washington began, moving up and down, a lot of the colonialists, the loyal colonialists, got out of that contact area, right? And it was an insurgency, right? So they leave that and they went down to Pensacola because it was safe, right? Florida's a backwater, we don't have to worry. So they actually had two of the units within the fort there, Fort George and Pensacola, were state militia, but loyalist state militia. So you're looking at Marylanders, but they're loyalist Marylanders. So you had Americans fighting Americans, right, on both sides. You had the First Nation tribe versus First Nation tribes on either side, and then you had Germans, the German coast, the French that brought over, fighting. I think it was a Westphalian group that the British had. It was an artillery unit that they worked in there. So it was absolutely fascinating in that this was the battle that was there in Pensacola. So you had the same group fighting each other just under different flags for different reasons. So I thought that was very interesting. And then that's a part of it. So when you look at the American Revolution, always think not just of Lafayette, don't think of just von Steuben. The name of Bernardo de Galvez, and say it with the that little Puss in Boots character there. So Antonio Banderas. That guy actually was a tremendous general, and George Washington wrote about him, and it saw his operational genius, right? His tactical and operational genius. He actually worked very well. The plans for the assault, I've got them here. I'm not going to go too much into it, but the plans for the assault were methodical. They were very good. They kept getting attacked, and then they actually weren't going to even go in the bay. They were so worried about the British bombardment. So I go down here. Then we'll transition over to something else real quick here. Okay, here we go. So again, these are pretty neat from University of Michigan, but the University of Florida was putting these out. And if you ever get there, University of West Florida does a phenomenal archaeology job. And a lot of this was unknown because not until the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and 2000s, did the archaeologists start to unearth a lot of the Spanish history. A lot of the archaeology was focused in, Jamestown and the New England settlements and things like that. The archaeology that focused on the early Spanish America, just wasn't there. But University of, like I said, West Florida and some others, especially in Florida, have done a phenomenal job. I mean, I'm absolutely impressed. I'll show you a book here in a second that I love, because they go into, this is the archaeological find, and this is what we estimate from the archaeological evidence, right? Here's the forensics, and this is what we estimate. And the scale of the settlement is a lot bigger, and the duration is a lot longer, and the interaction with a lot of the First Nations that are there was deep, and the trade was phenomenal. Like I said, they found China porcelain in a lot of the places, the presidios and the areas, the settlements within Florida and New Mexico. And you think, well, where'd that come from? Well, now, the trade, remember, all that silver was going over to China to buy the silks, mostly the silks, and then they were bringing that back. They had a very vibrant trade from the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, so about 250, 300 years before America even declares independence. They're dealing in trade between the Americas and Asia and Europe. So keep that in mind. But anyway, this is the British initial fort. The coastal fort is here. I don't know if you can see it. Coastal fort is here. Boy, that's really lagging. And that was a narrow channel, and there was a lot of potential for the ships to get beached. The admiral that was in charge of the fleet told Galvez no. It's too dangerous, and Galvez took command of the ship and said, "Yo solo," which means, I alone, and then he led the charge, and then the other ships eventually followed him, but he went through alone to charge up here. This is Pensacola. Now, to his credit, the governor of Pensacola, the governor of Florida, the British governor of Florida, basically is fighting the governor of Louisiana. So you have the governor of Florida fighting the governor of Louisiana. Nothing's changed. And for Pensacola, but they did do an agreement beforehand that said, we're only going to fight outside of the city because we don't want collateral damage, right? So good for them, the old kind of civilized thing. They said, not in the city. But there's a fort here. This is Fort George. So up on the hill that's behind Pensacola, it's now part of Pensacola, but there's Fort George, and there's two redoubts. There's the Center Redoubt, the Prince's Redoubt, and then the Queen's Redoubt, which is far north, because the majority of who the British were fighting was the other Indians. So the Creeks were aligned with them at times, but other branches of the Creeks were not. And so they were getting assaulted, basically every month, depending on the season, by large numbers of Creek Indians that would come down. So that's why the fort is facing this way. The guns are facing this way. So Galvez lands just to the west of Pensacola. The Creek Indians, the British keep sending the aligned group of Creeks to attack them. They gradually shift up. They set up a battis the whole way, dig trenches, large trenches, 4,000-foot trench they found, and then they set up some, basically the old equivalent of mortars, right? A couple of howitzers and mortars, and then they start shelling. Now they get lucky, and one hot shell falls right into the powder and blows up the Queen's Redoubt completely. I think 100-something people, soldiers died, British soldiers and American loyalists and German artillery guys die. And that collapses that northern ability. So once they gain that hill, it's all over for Fort George. So the British surrender, Pensacola's gone. West Florida now falls within that, but it's basically, like I said, Galvez, even taking the ship and going, yo solo, I'll do this alone, right? Because the admiral was too afraid to go through that channel. And his audacity and good planning, and very methodical how he moved up there and took control of that fort, did a great thing. Bring out the maps. Yes, lots of maps. Marcus, subscribe now. Looking forward to the course. Okay, yep, I'll get that set up there. Like I said, we had to revamp it for the kids because it was a little. My daughter was noticing it was a little too advanced, and and she's got a lot of that. She'll take over a lot of that, which is really good. She ran it in school here locally. She had a detective club to introduce kids to rational thinking, objective thinking, and looking at evidence, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning. What's the difference? So that'll be pretty good. So thank you, Marcus. I appreciate that. All right, so that's Galvez. Some good books on Galvez, since we're talking books. I'll show those, and then we'll transition to Patton versus Eisenhower, which is really why everybody's here. Like me, that was fascinating. All right. These are some good starter books on it. This one is Pensacola History Illustrated. Again, West Florida University, fantastic group. I was so impressed with them. While I was there in Pensacola. I wish I could have stayed longer, just amazing stuff. But it really goes into a lot of the nitnoid details about how the Spanish were in that area, and then about the campaign there within Pensacola. So it talks about a little bit about the Marines. So if you're interested in those South Carolina Marines that went river raiding, that's a good one. This one was interesting. I enjoyed this one. This is by Captain Christopher Bulmer of the British Royal Artillery. He wrote an article for this, and he's in the unit now that was the battery back then, right? The battery back then was formed up specifically for when the British got West Florida. And he says the batteries last longer than the regiments. So it's an internal look at some of the British military, which I find fascinating because they have just a tremendous history. I mean, for everything else, it's just fascinating. But so we're talking even in Afghanistan, that 20 battery is there. So that was him, 20 battery, and that's the one that was in Pensacola. So his unit, his battery, was the one that was in Pensacola, and he found their letters. He has their letters. That's how I knew, some of them were loyalists and things like that, American loyalists, because he talks about the equipment they had, the training, some of the deprivations they had to go through, before the war even started, because it really was kind of a backwater. Malaria, and hurricanes were kind of the threat, in addition to kind of the creeks, turning on a dime and attacking whenever they would do it. But he goes in and he has those letters from the defenders. That's absolutely fascinating. And he goes in there and you get to understand a little bit more about that system. So that's neat. And then this one is about the archaeology in Pensacola, which is fairly recent, into Fort George, because they're not quite sure where some of like the Queen's Redoubt is and things like that, because things were built over it. There was a Spanish fort afterward. There was a Confederate fort, U.S. Army fort, then a Confederate fort. So it's very interesting. Pensacola itself has been under 5 flags, right? So they were French, they were Spanish, they were British, then they were American, and they were Confederate, and then they're American again. So that city, Pensacola, has had 5 flags over it. So as far as I know, that's the record there. So that's a pretty good one. That's again, I think that's put out by the University of West Florida, but Pensacola History Illustrated, Journal of Pensacola and West Florida History, winter of 2011, volume 1, number 2, goes specifically into the siege of Pensacola. Fascinating, as a good initial overview. The second one, this is a consortium from all University of Florida, but it goes into I was telling you about the archaeology, which I like because it's forensics. So archaeology is fun, but it shows you, again, the how much the Spanish had moved in and kind of penetrated the United States. And of course, this is focused on Florida, but you really do see that there's a lot of areas. I mean, you're talking Tennessee, some of the settlements are up in Kentucky, not the big ones, but they had trade and trade posts in Kentucky. It talks about the various phases and cultures that occurred. It wasn't just a monolithic Spanish settlement or occupation. It was a very phase. They came in initially, warlike. So the first things, because they had just in 1492, remember they were been under war for about 300-400 years with the Moors, that the Islamic conquest of Spain, and then they were doing the Reconquista. They were fighting back. They were basically in a war for 400 years to get Spain back. And then they start expanding, right? Then they come over. So they're kind of, they have a very big military culture, which is about 300-400 years old, right? It's ingrained into their culture. So when they hit first in the Americas, it was initially very brutal, but then it had a different shape. So there was a Solis that came in, and he focused more on the missions, right? So it went from presidios and military, shifted over to missions. And then an interesting part in, I believe it was 1542, they passed a law that protected the two things. They protected the Native Americans, and they restricted the rights of landowners, because you had to do both, which I found fascinating, because they understood that dynamic, right? So in other words, they restricted the rights of landowners, Spanish landowners, because that was the only way to be able to protect some of the Indian or the Native American interest. So, and then they had to pass another law, I believe it was in 1580. So the first one was 1542, the next was in 1580. And then that was interesting. So they attempted to missionize at that point. Now there's some interesting parts here, but what got in there? So when the British came in, the Spanish forbid weapons to be sold to the Native Americans, right? So they didn't do a lot of weapon sales to the Native Americans, but they attempted to missionize them, right? So it was the big missionary kind of movement. That was the third phase of their thing. The first was pretty brutal, and then the second one was kind of a mixed bag. It kept getting hit by hurricanes and disease, but the third wave tended to be a little more focused on kind of the culture, the hearts and minds, as we call it, in Vietnam. But it was interesting. So in 1650 and 1750, Britain came in, and they were really hardcore into Native American slaves, which I wasn't aware of this. It was a huge slave trade. So I knew about the African slave trade, the West Indies slave trade, but I didn't know about the Native American, the First Nation slave trade. That fascinating. So 1650 and 1750, Native Americans in the Southeast, there's a new British trading system. Now the British didn't invent it. a lot of the nations, a lot of the tribes would, when they go to war, the same as we did in the West, the same as, Assyrians did and Persians did. When you capture another nation in battle, when you hit a village and you get slaves, right? You get them as slaves because you've lost warriors and you need to go farm, right? Because it's manual labor. That's a big deal, right? So nowadays we take tractors and finances, but back in those days they just took people. And the Native Americans did this, and so the British learned of the practice. They said, we need a bunch of slaves in Caribbean, right? And it cost a lot less to bring Native Americans from Florida and Louisiana down there in South Carolina to the Caribbean than it does to try to get a ship all the way across the Atlantic, because you're gonna lose a lot in the transit area, right, from Africa over. So it's a lot easier that way. And so I was like, oh man, what they did was, it was a weird system. It was interesting. So in Spanish Florida, it was forbidden in the mid 16th century to enslave the native people, and the policy was followed. However, the British came in there, and the traders offered this kind of an interesting thing. So the Indians, guns and ammunition were the most prized trade items. The British would sell them. They were allowed to. Doesn't mean the Spanish didn't, but the Spanish by law couldn't. So the British would sell guns on a debt system. Now, this is the interesting part to me. They set it up as a debt system. This is key. So the Indian slave trade operated on the British credit system. It started with Carolina merchants borrowing money in England to buy trade goods and shipping them to Charleston. Now, Charleston was part of the Florida at the time. Merchants then sold the trade goods on credit to the traders who went to Indian villages and towns in the interior. There, the traders contracted with individual natives and native groups to obtain captive and provided them with firearms and ammunition on credit to do it. So now they got two groups in debt, right? The merchants are in debt, and they make the Indians go in debt. And then the Indian slave hunters returned with captives. So the Indians would get money, or they get weapons, ammunition, and then they'd go out and they'd raid other Indian tribes, villages, settlements, and then they would come back with the captives. They would give it to the traders, the Carolina traders. Now they've erased their debt. Now the Carolina traders would then take those captives back, sell them in market, and then their debt's now erased to Britain, and then they would go down to the Caribbean, and then they would work in the sugar cane fields for that sugar trade. And so that system disrupted and destroyed the mission system in the Florida. So there were lots of missions up in there, but it destroyed the mission system, because the mission system had the priest would work with the native tribal leader to say, okay, we have this project. I'm going to give you X amount of trade goods in order for you, and you provide the labor to be able to do this project. But he would only work through the chief, or the headman of whatever organization he's working with on the Native Americans, right? And so that was the mission system. This system did away with it, right? Hey, we're getting guns, we're getting all this, and it really, and they went through how it transformed some of the tribes into just raiders. I mean, literally, they became like like what we imagine Viking raiders to be. That it changed the culture along that kind of that Gulf area, that Southeast American area. It changed a lot of those groups into even more warlike, right? And they lost the ability of some of them to be able to harvest and to be able to fish, because all the males are just solid on this because you're making big money, right? So it kind of wiped out or transformed a lot of the culture in that area. But at the same time, it wiped out the Spanish system that they had been working with and developing those lines of business, trade, relationship, culture with the Native Americans. So it was a win-win for the British, right? You make a lot of money, and then you're disrupting those lines of communication within. And that's why the Creek, by the time Galvez comes in there, 200 years later, and he's attacking Pensacola, you've got large groups of Creek that are very much aligned with Britain, because they had been provided those guns, and they were raiding the other native tribes. And the other native tribes were then on the Spanish side, because, hey, Britain's supplying that side. So it really does become a very interesting kind of insurgency, with different groups providing different mechanisms in there. But that was the British Indian slave trade system that was all by credit. So it was in debt. You put somebody in debt, and then you kind of force that trade. But it was very interesting, and it's all done through London banks, right? So everybody wins in that one. So that was fascinating. All right. And on the slave trade, we had a question when I posted some pictures, and I'm going to answer this quick, and then we'll go into Patton and Eisenhower. One more thing. The slave trade in New Orleans. So I posted a picture when I went down to New Orleans to look at some of the history down there, which is really, really fascinating again. But the big surprising part is it's longer Spanish than it was French, but for some reason it takes on a French character, right? French Quarter and all that. And then you look at it, you're like, wow, this is Spanish a lot longer. So, and there's even a German coast. I'm like, yeah. But the slave trade. So the first part, we're talking Indian slaves, and we're talking the Indian debt slaves that were created by the British slave trade to get the Indians to the Caribbean to work the sugarcane plants. Now we're talking just the slaves in New Orleans. And New Orleans had 3 flags over it. So it had the French, it had the Spanish, and then it had the Americans. Didn't have the British. Pensacola had the British. Those are the main players. So Spain had New Orleans from about 1763 to 1800. And depending on the numbers, and I saw different stats for it, 20 to 29,000 slaves were imported in. They bought theirs from the British, as did the French. The French had their own company, but the Spanish didn't have a system, even though they're right there next to Africa. They didn't have a system to bring over slaves. The British did, so they would buy from the British. They were allowed to, starting in, I think, 1798, they were allowed, which is really weird. 1782, Spain allowed purchase of slaves from the British in Jamaica with the port-free system. So even as they're going to war with Britain, they're doing some forms of trade, which is very interesting to me. But again, 1763, 1800, they were doing those, mostly bought from Britain. France, they had it from 1718 to 1763, and then 1800 to 1803. Remember, they bought it from the Spanish, and then they sold it to Americans, so they had it for 3 years after that. They had about 6,000 slaves. They stopped importing them because the death rate was too high. They said it was not profitable, so they didn't do it. But the United States, who had New Orleans from 1803 to 1864, when slavery was completely outlawed, there was 120 to 135,000 slaves. And this comes from a question one of the readers had, or one of the members had, it was Heimdall, I think. And he was asking who was responsible for the slave trade in New Orleans. So I looked at it and it's okay here. And then I broke it down to companies, because people think it's nations, but no, it's companies that do this, right? So it's companies that go in and do the slave trade. So who owns the companies? And it actually was a very robust slave trade industry. The French had their Company of the Indies, which did most of theirs. The British was the Royal African Company, and it was global. It was tremendous. It was British, and the members, the board of directors, the main officers of the company was King Charles II, James Duke of York, who later became King James II, Edward Colston, Sir John Banks. I mean, it was literally a royal company, a royal project. So that's, they're going to get preferences no matter where they go. So it really was a royal company that was doing a lot of that slave trade. And that's where the Spanish were able to buy some of their slaves from. And the majority of the British slaves were coming off that system for the African slave trade. I haven't found evidence yet that the Royal African Company was involved in the Indian slave trade, but I didn't look too deep on that one. I might later. But the Americans had a tremendous amount. So Franklin and Armfield, Bolton Dickens and Company, it was one of the largest. It was based in Memphis, Tennessee. They were huge. Theophilus Freeman and James Birch. If you've read the book 12 Years a Slave, that's what the slave was, one of their slaves, was Theophilus Freeman and James Burke. Bernard Kendis, Donovan and Wilson, John Hagan, Mark Davis, Thomas Boulder, Creswell, Wilkins and Linton, Eli Legg, William Ish, John McDonnell. So, and it was interesting, a lot of these later became trading houses and import-export, and some of them became lawyers, like their grandsons became lawyers, because I was tracing them down. So that was that, but they got their money initially with a lot of that. So it was quite interesting. And that, so that was, I just thought I'd put that out there, because that answered his question, because he was very interested in what was the New Orleans, who was responsible for New Orleans slave trade. So we found that out. So it was very interesting. Okay, the last 2 books, and then we'll go into Patton Eisenhower. So this is pretty good. Yeah, the picture's blurry. I've got 2 computers here, and we just have a new system set up. So apparently this other computer that I've got the second camera on is firewalling and stonewalling in my video. So I'll be I won't move things as much. I apologize for the resolution. I will work on that. I wonder if I could do this. Let me see. Hang on a second. Let me see if I can make this ghetto fabulous. Maybe not. See if I can use my phone like I did out in the cabin up on the border. And I don't think I can. Shoot. I'm sorry. Okay. So I'll hold it up here. I'm going to get rid of this. It's too blurry. We'll figure that out later. I used to break things for a living, so I still apparently have that trait. So, all right. So this is the other one, and this is interesting because it's local history. So this is a lot of essays that are done specific to the Spanish period within America. So you're looking, 1400s, 1500s, up to about 1700 within the Northern America. But this one goes into, and I'm not going to go into because I've already talked about it. Like I said, if you read our earlier article on Substack, The Silver Samurai, that was our triple silver series. The Wizard of Oz is really talking about silver. Wizard of Ounces. The gunfight at the OK Corral was about silver. And the Sengoku Jidai period was a lot about silver. But this talks about that thing. This talks about the silver trade from Mexico, which is Spanish, up through, and they tried to get it through Charleston, South Carolina. They tried to make a road all the way up so that it was easy. They didn't have to go through the Caribbean with the hurricanes and British pirates to get that silver over there to Spain. And then the other route was over to China because they were massively buying silk, and they had their own coin, right? The Portuguese and the Dutch didn't have silver, their own silver. So they had to do this complicated kind of trade system. Where the Spanish, it was just direct, which leads to the question. The Spanish had so many advantages in some ways. How did they fail, right? So in other words, by the 19th century, they're already a declining empire. So that's kind of what I want to look at is they have this all these tremendous advantages, and so much so that they get the British to stand down in the American Revolution and give us our freedom. A big contributor of that. But why did they fail? Why did they go? And the other thing is, why did America very shortly after that go to war with them? And we don't see them as an ally, right? Very, very quickly. And I actually saw that in the letters from George Washington. BCG, what's the title? So this is Hispanic American Essays in Honor of Max Leon Moorhead, edited by William Coker, and it's from the Pensacola Perdido Bay Press, 1970. I like old books. So, but like I said, it really outlines that Asian trade and how the Americans were trading in Asian goods via Spain, 1500s, 1600s, and that's why in this book over here, with the universities in Florida doing really great work in archaeology. So I can find a picture here. Yeah, so I mean they're digging up this. If you get a chance to go Pensacola, go to the museum. It's great stuff. But they're digging up recent. This is all within the last 20, 30 years, and they're finding all this stuff. But one of the pictures in here, and I should have put a tab on it, is showing Chinese porcelain. Right, it's a very old settlement that they found, and like, what Chinese porcelain? Yeah, because that trade, they were already, trans-Pacific trade was going on, and you're getting Chinese goods sent to Florida in the 1600s. So there was already the robust trade going on, and they fell into those systems. So history sometimes is a lot older than we think, and this is just a fun book. I'm going to have so much fun with this. This is my guilty pleasure, Florida Pirates. It's Florida Pirates from the Southern Gulf Coast to the Keys and beyond. James Casserman and Sarah Casserman. It goes back to, it does a little bit about historical pirates like Julius Caesar, way back, it's not Florida, but Mediterranean. Julius Caesar was captured by pirates. In the formation of America, right, we had to do we did a number of anti-piracy patrols with our Navy. But some of the history of pirates is absolutely amazing. And then the other part is in Congress, some of the first documents that we ever did. So this is a congressional letter of marque saying, go forth and rob, raid, pillage, all that fun stuff, British ships. So there's our Houthis right there, right? In other words, close down British shipping, right? Nothing new under the sun, and go forth and be a pirate, right? So of course John Paul Jones does great with that, but it shows the economics of it. It shows people take advantage of both sides. But one of the stories in here I found fascinating. It was an older story about a European princess who was betrothed to another a prince. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's an arranged marriage. She didn't like him. And so she actually ran away and she joined a pirate gang. And eventually she became the boss of the pirate gang. And then this guy she was supposed to marry ends up going after her, and she captures him. And then, but he had fought so well, she's like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll give you another chance. But I don't want to quote it because it's actually in here. And I looked it up, and I haven't seen the source docs, but everything online is saying, yeah, that story's true, and it's in here a little bit. But that was fascinating. But it goes through a number of pirates all along there. Florida was just a haven, the Caribbean, because you had two major powers. Spain, you also had France to a certain degree for earlier, but mostly Spain and Britain, and then America comes in. And Britain has got that crack cocaine, right? It's got sugar going up there. Spain has got silver moving across and gold, right? So, I mean, these are high value commodities moving through a tight, narrow space. And so there's a lot of competition. And then freebooters who's like, whatever we're going to do, whichever way they're going to go. And so then the U.S. Navy gets involved. But this book also goes up to rum runners. which is fascinating. So literally, so it's the Union blockade runners. It goes into some people trying to rob Union ships during the blockade, but the rum runners during Prohibition in the 20th century is fascinating. And it goes into James Horace Alderman. He was they call him a liquor pirate. And he would go out and raid liquor boats. But during when he was captured, he shot Coast Guardsmen and a Secret Service guy because they were investigating rum runners and stuff like that, literal rum runners. And so he was actually hung because there was a law that you hang pirates on the port that they were in. And so he was hung, I believe, in 1929. He was hung in a seaplane hangar at Bahia Mar in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, August 17th, 1929. He was hung. He's one of only 2 federal prisoners ever executed in Florida, and that's because of an ancient law that says whatever port that you bring that pirate into, that's where you hang him. So, I mean, we're hanging pirates in 1927 in Florida. So, yes, this is kind of a guilty pleasure. I haven't done the due diligence on it. I've just kind of taken a breeze through it, like I want to buy it, and I bought it. But that's interesting because, like I said, there's other evidence out there I've seen from some other documents I was looking at that tradition of piracy, especially in that region, contributed, believe it or not, to a very robust United States Navy and mercantile movement early on, right? So they had that skill set in there. So we've been very involved in pirate and anti-piracy, and sometimes they're the same, right? One minute you're a pirate, the next minute you're an anti-pirate. So you have this kind of skill set. So speaking of skill sets, that's the books for Pensacola. So we're going to transition now and skill sets. Now this has been a big deal of mine for a while. This is the battle between Patton and Eisenhower, and it does a couple things. Number one, it illustrates what I've been promoting for a long time, and it actually came. I did an interview, I think 4 or 5 years ago with Misako Ganaha, and it was the results of Colonel Sargas Sangari had asked us. He's a former U.S. Army guy, but he's Iranian, 10 years old. He escaped Iran, came to Chicago, joined the U.S. Army, and I met him over in the sandbox, right? So he was like, oh, okay, but he was Special Operations Forces, not Special Operations Support Forces, and then he was Persian, but he was 10 years old, from Chicago, but he could speak Persian and Assyrian, not Syrian, Assyrian. He's an Assyrian Christian. But anyway, he had a question, and it was, 4 years ago, if we go to war with China, if China does like a Pearl Harbor event, it could be cyber or whatever, how prepared are we, right? What was the glide path that the United States did on December 8th, 1941 that allowed us to win not just a one-front war, but a multi-theater war globally? And so I kind of delved into that, and the results, it's on that video with Misako Ganaha, and it was an eye-opener for me because it really highlighted that, especially on the Navy side, the interwar military was probably the best we ever had as far as planning, training, focus. These were incredible professionals in the United States Navy and Marines. And the ability for the United States to prepare for war in the Pacific was unmatched. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, Fulda Gap, that Reforger, all the stuff that nothing has ever come close. And I tried to look up anything that was declassified from the Cold War. Did we have a plan against Russia? And the answer is no. We had some defensive stuff. So if one Russian general went nuts and started trying to attack, okay, we're going to do Reforger there in the Fulda Gap in Germany, but there's nothing about like a multi-phase operation where everybody trains on it every year. So to put this in context, the United States Navy had a War Plan Orange 1906, 1907 to go to war with Japan, always with Japan. The assumption Japan was going to attack first. That was always built into the plan. 1911, fully fleshed out 3-phase operation. It's going to last about 4.5 years after the initial attack, sneak attack. And we're going to have to figure out, okay, we're going to circle Japan and then bombard it and strangle it to death, right? And that's it. Total. That was the entire plan. And then in 1923, when Japan's supposed to be our ally because they were on our side in World War I, or we were on the same side with them, with Britain in World War I, we start training on that plan with full-scale, massive exercises every single year. And those are the fleet problems. They call them fleet problems. And they didn't notionalize. And so as a military guy, I love that, right? I hate it when notionalized. Okay, we're going to pretend like we just marched 20 miles. Yeah, I can't test my equipment, right? If you're going to drive a vehicle, drive it, right? 24 hours of drive, hot swap that vehicle, just, keep the driver and TC going and, push it, right? How far is this? Push it till you break it, right? And that's the thing in training, push it till you break it. But unfortunately there's a kind of a zero tolerance policy that moved up in the 90s in the U.S. military, and it kind of raised its head again, and training was backsided. And now there's a lot of simulation. Everybody's like simulate, and you need as realistic training as you can get at scale, right? So you need to notionalize not just the distances and the numbers, but you need it scale, right? So if it's a corps commander practicing, he needs to understand how a corps operates in the field and all the Murphys that'll happen, all the mistakes that are going to happen, everything that's going to go wrong during that operation. And so the Navy, I knew. The Navy was like, they're great. They did amazing stuff. Fletcher-class destroyer came from that. Gato-class submarines came from that. All the equipment that we had in World War II had been laid down, keel designed, because of those 20 years of just training. And Admiral King and Admiral Fletcher, right, Admiral Halsey, they were Ensign Fletcher, Ensign King, Ensign Halsey, working this plan, training on it every single year for their entire military career. And when you went to Naval War College, you're training on the plan. You're doing the spade work. You're doing the assumptions. You're doing the war gaming. You're doing all that stuff in the plan. They are laser focused. In 1935, they began to look at, okay, now we're going to incorporate Germany in this, right? Because Germany was gone in 1923 when they started training this. 1907, it wasn't really a threat to us. It was to Britain, and then Britain convinced us it's our threat. Anyway, so the Army side, though. So what we hear always is we were sleeping and, everything was gone. So I thought, okay, the Army side. But the Army had some amazing training, right? So in the 30s, there was actually the 3rd Army based there in Texas. They did really big training on a divisional level and a kind of a corps level, but their own individual unit. In 1939... September 8th, 1939. So September 1st, the war starts in Europe. September 8th, 1939, President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signs a preliminary or provincial emergency decree, right? So it's a mobilization, basically. And within a year, we have 1.6 million people under arms in 1940 and the beginning of 41. Before Pearl Harbor, right? We're already mobilizing. We're already getting ready. And he reaches down into the ranks and promotes ahead of a bunch of people. I mean, just promotes them, right? It's unheard of now. He just reaches down and pulls up Marshall, right? So that's General Marshall, who's a great planner. He retains Embeck, who is Wiedemeyer's father-in-law. More on that later. But he has a knack for picking leadership in the military, right? So that's the good thing is these guys are picked well. So Marshall is a good planner. He picks Leslie. Oh, shoot, what was his name? Leslie was his first name, but I call him Leslie. But anyway, he was really good on training. So this group got together. They said, we're going to do pretty much what the Navy does with fleet problems, but we're going to do it for the Army now, right? Because the Army you can mobilize later. Navy takes decades sometimes to get a ship hull and systems and train on it and, sea cruises, seaworthy cruises and get this thing down and new systems and how it integrates and all that. But an Army, a tank, okay, that's quicker. And because of the evolution, the Ordnance Board from Aberdeen was very much looking at the Spanish Civil War. They were very much looking at the Winter War. They were very much looking at all the little conflicts that were going on, seeing the evolution of systems, anti-tank systems, tank systems, aircraft, ground attack, aircraft, all of this. They were looking at it. They realized, okay, if we started in mid-1930 with some Army systems, they're going to be obsolete pretty quick. Let's just hold on. But we have to get the form, we have to get the organizational structure ready. And that's what this was. And this was called the Louisiana Maneuvers. There was actually a series of 3. So South Carolina, Louisiana, and then a little bit Texas, Kentucky. But they were looking, the big one was like Louisiana. And they said, this is going to be a core level, multi-core level training event, right? And over 600,000 U.S. soldiers were mobilized out of that 1.2 million that had been soft mobilized. They're going to go down and they're going to run in about 300,000 acres square, or 300,000 square acres in Louisiana and Texas, right? Just go, use it as a maneuver area. And they chose Louisiana because if you've been to northern Louisiana, around what's now Fort Polk, and was Fort Johnson, now it's Fort Polk, Pison Ridge, that area up north, there's a lot of different, you could be in it feels like the desert. It's like a plain, like a savanna, because they've cut down all the long pine trees. And then all of a sudden you're in like a bayou, right, with swamps and like the mud and then the heat, and then you're back in the pine forest. You're like, oh, this is nuts. And then there's some broken terrain. You have this variety, right? And it's hot, right? It's like the old saying, it's it's like it's hot. In fact, some soldiers when they were deployed in Tunisia and Africa, a reporter came up and asked him, he says, how's this heat here in Africa? He says, well, at least it's not Louisiana. Like literally, it's a quote, right? In Stars and Stripes. At least it's not Louisiana. So they're there in a very, very inclement environment, snakes, fire ants, all that. And they trained on a core level. And the United States military, with Embick and Marshall, were giving report cards, right? So they're looking at everybody from major up to see who is a war fighter and who can handle this because it's all been notional. The United States military never trained at corps level. It never really even had division on division at a good war fighting, right? And Marshall and Embick and others remember that from World War I. We just weren't prepared. So we had folks going over. It took 18 months to field the first unit over to France once the Declaration of War came out from Woodrow Wilson in World War I. They said, no, we're not going to go through that again. We're going to be ready before the first shot is fired on America. We're going to be ready for it. And they did. And they prepared for it. And they did this huge exercise called the Louisiana Maneuvers. And like I said, it was massive. They had guys coming from Fort Knox, and they literally convoyed down. They had cavalry units coming over from Texas. They had people marching from South Carolina. I mean, massive statewide mobilizations and movement. This is absolutely essential before conflict, right? Like, how do you load up? How do you secure gear, right? How do you move it? How do you take gear down? You know, how long is this thing going to work before it breaks down? How does it break down? How does a half track break down? All these little questions that come up there. And it was just absolutely amazing. So it's this kind of fascinating look at an interwar army, right? With equipment, you've got still cavalry units, you've got, not even a half track, but it's getting there. World War I uniforms, the interwar uniforms, and the doctrine. They had to figure it out. So the main thing was corps commanders. I want corps commanders that are going to be operating. I'm looking at everybody from, division to brigade to see, okay, who am I going to move up and whom we're going to move out to get ready for the war in Europe? And how are we going to do air power? So armor, anti-tank, air power. How does this all work together? And then communication, command communication, control. And that was the big deal. So you had, I think this is Many, Louisiana. So I've been trying to, if you look at the old photos, I'm going through some of the old photos. And so far, I think this is Many, Louisiana, which is north of Leesville. You go way up north of Leesville, and the Battle of Camden. So this may be some of that moving up. But they did two big things. They had a red army and a blue army, and they said, this is your maneuver area, which was between the Sabine River and the Red River, basically all of Louisiana, right, except for Nolens, right? So from Lake Charles up to Natchitoches and a little bit of Texas, that's your maneuver area. Red team, here's your thing. You have to go down and try to capture Lake Charles. Blue team, you have to try to come up and destroy their area, Barksdale, north of Alexandria. So through the whole state, they maneuver, and they literally, armor units, aircraft units, you name it. Aircraft were based in Mississippi. They're flying into Louisiana for bombing runs. It was just phenomenal. And like I said, a huge maneuver area. They had two big iterations, right? So Red was trying to come down, and they had General Lear in the north, and it really became a test of the kind of the conservative use of armor versus the aggressive use of armor. And this was going on as as events in Europe were occurring, right? So they're learning real time and getting information from Europe on real tank battles and things like that. So they were trying to figure this out, and it was absolutely amazing. One of the interesting parts was, like I said, General Lear was up north. He was red team, and General Kruger was down here with blue team. And General Lear was kind of we call him a garrison commander, right? It's a parade ground, prince. So he was all about spit and polish, and he was an interwar, he was very much a garrison kind of guy. But Kruger was like, let's go get him. And he had Eisenhower as one of his staff bubbas. And Eisenhower's a great planner. I mean, people don't realize how good Eisenhower, Wiedemeyer, Embick were as planners. And you can't forget that. There's a commander, yeah, but a great commander will fail unless he's got great logistics behind him. And that requires planners to kind of make things happen, right? Where's the fuel? Where's the water? Where's the spare parts? How are we going to get this? Who's going to lay the comm wire? All those little details that will make or break an operation. And that was all planned at scale. And so the first iteration, Lear was very cautious. He's going by the book, step by step. And Patton was with Lear. So Patton was on a leash. And Patton, contrary to Patton, stayed on the leash, right? Because he'd been chastised. Remember in the Mexican-American War, way back before we even got into World War I, with our little training event to try to get ready for World War I, which was kind of the Spanish-American War, or the Mexican-American against Pancho Villa. But he got kind of in trouble for that one. So that kind of affected him. So he kind of slowed his roll a little bit. So he's obeying General Lear. He's chomping at the bit. And he's moving methodically forward. And they get to a place that's they call it the Battle of Camden, and actually visited that area. So went north of there. I wanted to walk the terrain and see what the terrain was. But basically the Battle of Camden was where Patton was trying to move down and hit the crossroads to come down to Leesville. I don't know if you could see that, but Leesville's right there where Blue's kind of coming up. And that's now where Fort Polk is. Fort Polk wasn't there then, right? It's there because of these maneuvers, because hey, this is a great place to train, at scale. So that's where Fort Polk comes from. But the Battle of Camden, that's the area that's basically over that little hill. There's a church out there. If you go over that rise, there's a cemetery. That's where the anti-tank guys were hiding. You had to get this crossroads. So sure enough, Patton and his guys come up here to the crossroads, and they get waxed, and he gets waxed hard. And the tanks just get decimated. So the American armor from the red group that's supposed to be moving down there, they get flanked, they get hit. I mean, it was rough, right? Everything around them they were just getting hit. If you look at the terrain, this is part of the open terrain, but if you cross over that little road, now you're in those long, what they call long pine. And you're getting waxed by anti-armor and all that sort of thing. Big ambush country when you go over there. So very tough for armor. But if they can get in the open area, they got great maneuver, and they can go down and hit Leesville and flank it, and then move on to DeRidder and parts south. But that was the lesson for Patton. Was like he hated that. He was chomping at the bit. He was furious. And he was somewhat of a legend even then, right? So I think it was colonel. He got promoted colonel during this period of time. But he moved up, and he was like, "Oh, this is terrible," because it was mostly Eisenhower's plan, right? And Eisenhower's watching Patton. It was like, well, he doesn't do real well in a leash, right? Because he got waxed, and he got waxed again and back. And then on that iteration, the first iteration was interesting because one of the cavalry units from Blue crossed over the Sabine River at night in a cavalry. So horse cavalry crossed the Sabine River at night, didn't lose a person. Right, and then they flanked and went up and harassed Patton. So he's getting hit by cavalry guys. So I mean that was really embarrassing for Patton in the first go around. Then the second go around, so that was the first week. Then they said, okay, index reset. Red lost heartily. There's a whole big thing in there. I'll give you a link to the U.S. Army Historical War College analysis of what they call the GHQ maneuvers. But this is the Louisiana maneuver phase. And the second one, they said, okay, we're going to give Patton to Blue Team. All right, give him to Kruger. Let's see what two hotheads do, right? Because Kruger's aggressive, Patton's aggressive. Give Patton to Kruger. Let's see how this goes. Patton, he's like, screw Louisiana. He goes to Texas. He crosses the Sabine River, insane, right? He goes way flank, and then he doesn't even worry about resupply because he realizes you can fill up at petrol stations, right? So he's got cash, he's got big money. He starts handing it out, and they literally are filling up at fueling stations in Texas, flanking the heck out of it. He shows up north of north of Natchitoches, and then comes down and his forward element, before they called the whole exercise, his forward element was already capturing folks in Barksdale. He was already capturing like headquarters in Barksdale, right? Because he just flanked the crap out of them. And it was that audacity. And Eisenhower remembers that. Bradley remembers that. Marshall remembers that. If Patton's on a leash, he's not going to be good. And Patton learned that himself, right? If sometimes you follow orders, you're going to die. That's the choice you got to make as a commander at some level. If you follow an order, you might not come back, right? And you have to make that choice. Is it your career, or are you going to win the battle, right? And a lot of commanders have actually gone through that kind of decision process. So Patton from this learned that. Eisenhower learned about Patton, right? If you let him off the leash, he's going to do great things. He's going to do amazing things. It's dangerous as heck, but he's going to do it, right? And he's going to go crazy with it. And he did. So that was very formative in a young Patton, who's a colonel. I think he got promoted general after that. And in the staff, right? Because the staff learns about each other, and they have a report card. So General Marshall wrote a report card of all the commanders throughout this thing. I think it's like 100-something commanders. And yeah, these are good. Nope, these guys need to go. Yeah, and these guys maybe move over to logistics, and these guys, they just need to go home. They need to retire. And that was very formative. And then they went up to South Carolina. They did very similar in South Carolina, huge maneuvers. All of this way before Pearl Harbor. And it changed the landscape too. Louisiana was never quite the same, especially around Peason Ridge, because after that, they basically told those communities up in Peason, you need to go. We're going to build a base here. This is going to be a training range, and it's time to go. So that was the interesting part. For books, if you're interested, it's called the U.S. Army GHQ Maneuvers of 1941. This is official U.S. Army history, so it's actually pretty good. 1992, but still excellent. And it goes into the nitnoid detail of it. They don't really focus on Patton, but if you know his unit, where he was under General Lear and then under General Kruger in the second phase, you can kind of follow along. And then they talk about the transformation of the Army. So for, you war nerds out there, this is really good for what was the transformation. And again, that focus. If we had not done this, as Marshall said, I want to break things and learn the lessons in Louisiana because I don't want to be doing it in Europe. Tunisia was rough. North Africa was rough, Operation Torch in the beginning, but it would have been far worse if we hadn't done this. It would have been absolutely far worse. What equipment works, what doesn't. I mean, just a tremendous amount of focus, tanks, anti-tanks, and aircraft. And also the other thing that happened in a small town called Alexandria, which is now a hellhole. But back in those days, it was a small town called Alexandria, Louisiana. It was General Marshall, Colonel Patton, and a few of the others, Eisenhower and a few other staff guys, huddled, literally conspiratorially huddled in a basement of a school after this whole exercise was over and made the decision that they are going to recommend, without consulting anybody else, they're going to make the recommendation that they want a separate armored corps. Because before then, armor was between infantry and cavalry. So the infantry called it tanks, but they didn't want it. I mean, it was like the orphaned child of the infantry was tanks. Cavalry, in order to get around the rule that only tanks can go to infantry, created something called mechanized. So they had armored cars, getting as close as they could to tanks, and they worked with that. And so that was mechanized cavalry, and then there was tanks. So that's why the armored corps is called the armor corps, because they didn't want to use the word tank. It's not a tank corps, and it's not a mechanized corps. It's armor corps, because it was neither the infantry nor the cavalry. It was its own branch. And they did that. They went up to Washington and pretty much sidelined the infantry commanders, sidelined the cavalry commanders who were there. They just didn't invite them to the meeting. And then it went up to the president. The president goes, okay, great, let's do it. So part of that was, yes, we need to, how are we going to organize this thing to do it? You need a separate armor corps in order for any of this to be successful, because an infantry commander is not going to handle armor real well. And a cavalry commander, they got their other things going there. So it goes both iterations. It's really neat, really nerdy, all that kind of fun stuff. There's also a good project on one of the Louisiana channels about oral history. It was filmed in the early 80s, and it literally goes into these people. Some of the people from the local area and some of the soldiers about the Louisiana maneuvers and what it meant for them. So it's fascinating to listen to some of the kids talk. There was an 18-year-old girl that one of the recon pilots was like throwing notes down to her. He wanted to meet her, and all that going on. But again, it highlights that the professionalism of the U.S. military, it's not that myth. We weren't sleeping, and suddenly on December 8th, 1941, now in righteous anger and indignation, we went forward and mobilized everything. We were mobilizing well before. We were thinking about the problem. We were training hard for the problem. People died in this training. Guys drowned. There's a tank that's still out there. I mean, I knew this myth when I was in high school. They're like, yeah, Peace Island Ridge is a tank. I'm like, yeah, whatever. But I mean, this area out there, there's mud. There's like red clay and mud and freaking swamps. And people were drowning. The equipment's literally getting bogged in mud. There's a tank that sank. They're trying to salvage it. There was a tank that sank in 1950s. What was it? It was an armored personnel carrier, but it had a huge 50 cal on top. It sank. It was monstrous. I don't know, M43. Let me go back. Don't quote me on M43 or M48, 1950s, but it's out there somewhere. They built a highway over it because they can't get it out. But that's how hard they were training. That people died. An aircraft P-40 aircrew died because they collided with a Navy bomber that was in that area. They were going in there. He was the defensive, and that they maneuvered too close. So this was the hard training, because again, you bleed in training. The more you bleed in training, the less hopefully you're going to bleed in combat. So we were focused on it. And again, I just want to kind of show this because that was Patton versus Eisenhower. But the result of that battle was Patton recognized, go with what you know. And Eisenhower realizes, let Patton go, let him run, let him hunt. And then they handpicked the commanders that were aggressive, that could handle that stress and strain and be aggressive. And win wars. And that was a deliberate process that was in there. And then they continued that up in North Carolina. And these types of exercises at least continued into the early part of Vietnam, because my dad was involved in Operation Swift Strike. Twilight in West Virginia was Special Forces part of it. But Swift Strike, and that was maneuver area in North Carolina, West Virginia, Virginia. I mean, they were using states as maneuver areas with divisional at that point. Oh, and then the final one in here, I'm going to track it down, but there was an airborne unit. There was experimental parachute unit. And they basically went behind the lines to Red and just created havoc. They're blowing up bridges and, stealing stuff and all kind of craziness. But it really is a fascinating look at, the early warriors. So I wanted to highlight that one. Okay, so this is all the same guys that broke up the bonus march. Well, the big bonus march was, that was MacArthur. And I remember Eisenhower he was really hurt about that. He didn't like that. That ate him up. So the bonus march, for those that don't know, that was a good point there by Goat. Early in the 1920s, the World War I veterans were promised a bonus, right? After a certain amount of time, the bonus you get from serving in World War I, because there's no GI Bill, there's nothing else there, but they wanted to be able to try to give them money that was going to come to them. And it was more pegged to their retirement. But what happened was the Great Depression, and the veterans were like, hey, how about federal government, you pay us now, because we really, really need it. We're hurting here. And the federal government's like, well, how about no? So the veterans camped in Washington, D.C. They all marched up. It's called the Bonus Army. They marched up to Washington, D.C. They had a peaceful protest. They're out there camping. And MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, basically went in, and depending on which way you read it, I tend to think he was aggressive, and he was a very political guy. So I'm pretty sure that he did use of force that was not within the best interest of all concerned, and those tents were on fire. People got killed, people got hurt. He aggressed. He used the U.S. Army to basically shoot and in some cases kill, and then burn the tents and the possessions of veterans that were hurting very hard from the Great Depression. So yeah, again, in our history, you can usually look back, and there's very, very hard points in the history. So yeah, the Bonus Army March, and then General MacArthur's actions against that. And then later on, he got sidelined out to the Philippines, and it was kind of a near thing where they actually rescued him from the Philippines. There was discussion whether they're going to leave him in there to make him a martyr. They're like, oh, that's what he wants. That's what Dougie wants, I think was the quote from one of the senators. But they thought, well, that would not be good, so they actually rescued him off, unfortunately, and then left a lot of really good commanders on the island to be captured. So there's a lot of history of MacArthur. in fact, Warplane Orange. It's one more thing here for you war nerds out there. Warplane Orange, the plan was Admiral King and all that. So Admiral King was theater commander. He'd worked this since an ensign. I mean, they planned this thing, they did it, and if you look at actually the way that it went off, it was perfect except for two things based on the plan. One was MacArthur wanted his own theater, and that was never in Warplane Orange, right? All the Guadalcanal, all that, we didn't need that. It was just not in the plan. But MacArthur's screaming for it, right? I want Operation Cartwheel, I want this. Okay, so they give MacArthur a theater. So that's why the Pacific Theater split between MacArthur and King, right? Basically the Navy and the Army, because MacArthur demanded a theater, but it was never in the plan. we planned this thing, trained on it for 20 years, and he comes in like, So that's why they kind of like, okay, here's your little thing, but it was never that important because it wasn't part of the plan. That was the first thing that didn't go according to plan. The second thing that was big difference was it was always an air bombardment to destroy Japan, or sea. First was sea bombardment, blockade, economic blockade, sea bombardment, and reduce Japan. The feasibility studies were throughout the 20s and the 30s that, the building of the Japanese cities, predominantly wood, paper, conflagration. So they're working on, DuPont was working on incendiary devices, submunitions, and bombs, well before the war, right, for Japan. This was always in the plan, but it was going to be air power. And then gradually the plan was adjusted because technology was increasing, right? So B-17s, go forward. Now that gives you extra range. Okay, now we can look at these bases to be able to hit there. Okay, Tinian now becomes important. Okay, I can go here. So they begin to look at those type of issues. But the thing that was never in the plan was an island invasion of Japan, like the home islands. They didn't need to. Once the Japanese Navy is gone, they can't project power. Who cares? And, oh, by the way, speaking of MBIC, all right, final thing, and then I sign out here. This is a good one. It's called Wiedemeyer Reports, and it's by General Wiedemeyer. MBIC was his father-in-law. General Wiedemeyer was the guy that took War Plan Orange and made it Rainbow, which was basically their 5 Rainbow plans that were built up in the late 30s, because we had to stitch War Plan Orange with, now there's Europe, there's Nazi Germany, so we got to stitch these two together, and let's assume we're going to have to support Britain, and Roosevelt actually said Soviets, right? Because what did he know, right? Because he was part of that group that supported the Bolsheviks. Well, he personally not, but his associates, because FDR was actually very much a creature of Wall Street. He was huge. He was like on 21 boards. Everybody thinks of him as an outsider. No, he was the insider's insider in Wall Street. When he got done with Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, he went over and worked for Wall Street for about 10 years, and then suddenly becomes governor of New York, and then becomes president, right? So, but yeah, he was sitting on boards. He was president of a bunch of shell companies and corporations. He was very much on Broad Street. But going back to this, the War Plan Rainbow plans were made by a guy named Wiedemeyer. And Wiedemeyer, in the back of this, he talks about Carbonado, which was his plan he took over from Stilwell. So Stilwell got kicked out of China. Wiedemeyer gets sent in there, actually gets along with Chiang Kai-shek. He starts training the Chinese army. They start moving up. And toward the end of the war, he has the plan, and it's in here actually with Carbonado. And you'll actually see where he's got patents. So all these units are going to go from Europe over to Asia. And because we have armor and everything, we're going to do this. We're going to do a land war up in there. Now, he doesn't have the full details about the Soviets coming down into Manchuria, so he doesn't know that. But he's going to pretty much wipe out the Kwangtung army with Patton with armored units coming over from Europe, and then that's going to wipe them out on the Asian continent. And then we just sit there and the Japanese are starving out, right? They don't have anything. We got Korea, we got Manchuria, we got, China's not getting hit anymore. The British are already starting to move up in Southeast Asia, right? So after the Imphal campaign, right, the 54-day battle, longest battle I think in Asia was the Imphal. They're already moving through Burma, right? They're moving into the border with Siam, Thailand. They've taken over. I mean, Japan was done, right? And the plans, everybody was working on these plans. So War Plan Orange didn't need to invade the home islands, right? Wiedemeyer, who had planned World War II in Europe, including the industrial mobilization, this genius, right? Him and Eisenhower worked together, and he's Embik's son-in-law. I mean, he was one of the genius planners. He went over there and fixed China, right? Works with Chiang Kai-shek, fixes China, says, here's how we do it. And then, so he's confused about Operation Overlord. He's confused. He's like, why do we have to invade the home islands? It doesn't make any sense. They're not going anywhere. Once we clear them out of here, they can barely move here. They just spent everything they had on one final offensive, Ego. And that was it, right? 1945 offensive, they were spent, right? And then the Soviets are going to come down, and they're wiping them through Manchuria. They're going to hit them in North Korea. So what do we got left? So that was the other thing that was different within War Plan Orange. It was supposed to be a siege, and somehow the planners changed their mind, or the command staff changed his mind. It had to be a land invasion of the home islands, and oh my, look what happened in Iwo Jima. Well, that was just propaganda to get the bomb to be dropped, right? Because we needed to test this new technology. Operationally, didn't need to, and all the stuff that everybody goes through. That we needed to drop the bomb. The plan was never to do that, right? And we didn't need to. How are they going to project power? The Yamato's at the bottom of the sea. They don't have a navy, right? Half of their aircraft are on Marianas gas. They're up 40 to 60% engine power because they don't have fuel because that's gone, right? And they're losing ground everywhere they're going, and the noose is tightening, right? It's a siege. You don't have to storm the castle walls, right? They're starving. Leave them alone. And oh, by the way, they're sending out peace feelers. That's the other part of that. So that was the other part of the War Plan Orange that wasn't according to the book, was that we dropped an atomic bomb because there was going to be a land invasion. We had to save lives, right? There was never a land invasion of the home islands. There was other stuff. But anyway, that's part of it, but you'd never know unless you look at the whole planning process. Okay, any other questions? And then I will have to punch out of here. Oh, one last thing. Masako had a good question the other day, and I'll see if I can pull it up here. There's a number of companies. Let me read. I'll just read it out here. I won't try to put it on the board. So this is more in the modern investigations, kind of what we're doing. So Masako Ganaha, for those that know her, noticed there was an article about a company that was buying a number of books, and they're buying books, all kind of old books from arcane dealers all over the place. They're scanning them, and then they're destroying them. And, I always talk about, the old books are prime, right? So like Wiedemeyer's reports, this is important, right? Half the books I've got, especially in my cast, you're never going to see those anywhere, right? They're not scanned online. There's a ton of stuff, even in my other job. Most of the information is not online. It's like an iceberg. Very few bits of data are actually online, especially archive data. And you're not going to get the full picture of everything, right? Source documents are very important, very big to look at. And older books are very, very important. And there's a company that she noticed that was it was called Zoom Books, and they're up in Canada. They were buying a tremendous amount of books from all these booksellers all over, arcane books that nobody's really thinking about, older books, and then they're just destroying them. And so that was pretty interesting. So she wanted me to look into that. I said, okay, let me take a look. And this is what we kind of got. That it wasn't just one company. It's actually a number of companies that are doing this, and a couple companies that you'll recognize were doing this for a while. Which is pretty bad. So Zoom Books Limited is in Canada. They're the lead vendor, but they received a key procurement zones was Germany and Switzerland, and we're still chasing down if they were able to get financing from elsewhere. So they may be connected to something else, or they're a front company, right? So keep in mind, sometimes the company you see isn't the one that's actually operational, right? They're not the boss. They look like it, but they're just the fall guy. Anthropic is the end client. It's not a book buyer. But they Anthropic hired a guy named Tom Turvey. He was the former head of Google Books Partnership to manage Project Panama internally. They purchased books through the vendors' distributors, then operated their own scanning and destruction operations. So there's another one. And then Microsoft, which was interesting because that was Microsoft and OpenAI. But OpenAI and Microsoft partnered with Harvard Libraries to train AI on 1 million public domain books. So far there's no destruction in that, but they're scanning them.
And what I've seen, though, sometimes in archives and records, they say, well, it's digital, and then they don't have to worry about preservation of the original. But anything electronic degrades, right? Just like paper degrades. But paper is actually less prone to degrade than electronics. And I'm not kidding. All right, there's things that from 15 years ago, like, again, I talk about it again and again, Lotus Notes on a 3.5-inch floppy. How are you going to read the information off that? Right? But a book from 100, 200 years ago, I can still read it. Right? So if you scan the stuff in there, the degradation, hard drives fail, right? Data gets corrupted. Sometimes things go offline and they just disappear. So even though Microsoft is saying they're working with Harvard for that, the danger is that even if you scan things in and you say you have an online copy, a lot of times they think, oh, this is cheap, this is the way of the future, and they forget about the paper copies, and they take those, even if they don't preserve them, or even if they do continue their preservation on them, they remove them from public access. So I can't go in and look at that original document. And there's a lot of information you can get that you can't get off of a scanned document, right? So sometimes you can actually tell when somebody had a note in their writing because you get that little imprint from in there, and you can actually look in the light, and I can see where somebody wrote a note on that page, right? But the ink isn't there, but the indentation's there because they had a piece of paper over there and they're writing a note, right? So there's a lot of information in there that you can see. Some things in scans don't show up. The old plat maps, insurance maps, right? These are great. They used to insurance companies used to map the heck out of cities, and they'll paste over it, right? So you have something, if there's a new construction, they would just take a new piece of paper and put it over that. And I can look through the page sometimes with light and go, there's a building there before this one. On a scan, I can't tell that. So there's a danger even in that one that Harvard will go, well, it's already scanned in over to OpenAI. We don't need to show this to the public anymore to save some money. So there's a danger in that, even if they're not destroying the book. There's a couple more. There's a proxy dealer network. So we're still chasing that down. And then there's a bunch of them, for some reason, German and Austrian dealers. There's a bulk purchaser book in Germany and then Sweden that seem to be using that with Book Outlet, Biblio. They're using those. So there's a lot going on other than that. There's a good article with Washington Post. They did an investigation looking at some of these proxy booksellers. So keep your mind on that one as well. Especially if you're a dealer in old books or collect old books, watch out who you're selling to, because it may be the end of the road for that book. They may just scan it and destroy it, which is horrible. So keep that in mind. That's another memory hole that's being created, and it possibly, I'm sure some people have that as intentional, right? They want to wipe out information. I know this for a fact, but sometimes it's unintentional, right? So it's a combination of intentional and unintentional that they're destroying information and making a memory hole that we just can't get back once those books are gone. So keep that in mind on it. I think that's about it. Yep. And again, good job to Goat for the insulator, the glass insulator out there in the Navajo. This was from the Navajo Nation. It's if you ever go through the Navajo Nation there in Nevada, it's actually pretty cool. It's cheese grocery store, right? Say cheese, CHEE. And there's just fantastic stuff. The best fry bread. It's Navajo fry bread. You just can't beat it. It's so good, and all difference in there. But yeah, the lady making the fry bread outside in a little booth, she definitely does look like she could probably kill you. It was a hot day, and I don't think she wanted to be cooking the fry bread, but it was delicious, and I'm glad she didn't kill me. I'm glad I got to enjoy that fry bread because it was fantastic. But they got a lot of really great stuff there, and then a lot of amazing history also there in that Navajo Nation, and even just that store. They have the history of the store in there. All right. Any other questions? If not, I will go ahead and sign out for now. Thank you very much. Went over a lot of what I thought. This will be back online. That'll be this whole series will be online again. I'll try to cut it up into shorts for some of the topics to make it a little bit easier. And then if you're interested in that Think Like a Detective course, again, it's free to all people that pay up on this thing. We're not going to set up a separate payment system and all that nonsense. If you're a member here, you're subscribed on Substack, you'll get one iteration for you, one iteration for your kid. Give me about 2 weeks, because we're going through all the kid stuff now to make it kid friendly. And then the stickers, I think we're still waiting on the Cricut printer to get finished with all the stickers. So we have these the kids get a little cool set. So if you have a kid, if you don't have a kid, you want to give it to your grandkid or gift it to somebody, yeah, just let us know. We'll give them the access code that they can go through and they can look at all the videos and stuff like that. And then about once a month, we're planning on once a month. We did it twice a month last time, but work schedule got too crazy for me. So once a month, either I or my daughter will be on. She's a licensed PI as well. We'll be on, and then that's a one-to-one. Most stuff is the videos and things like that. But then there's a one-on-one where they can ask all kind of questions. They can brief us on their cases that we give them and all that fun stuff. And then we can show them that kind of stuff. So thank you very much. No other questions. Nothing's coming through, and we will call it a night. Yep. All right. Thank you everybody for showing up. Be safe out there, and save your books.